Well, hello, Michael. Good evening to everyone else who is watching at home. I am delighted to be joining you here and in a few moments as well with Fionnán O'Connor. We are in possibly one of the most, at least for me, the most anticipated tasting of the year. We are going to be speaking with Fionnán O'Connor and, of course, Michael Walsh about the Vintage Mash Bills program undertaken by Boann Distillery. I'll be the host and MC for this evening, so I will be keeping, I suppose, everything in check while the guys talk us through 10 absolutely stellar and very interesting and different mash bills. We have a lot to get through this evening. There are 10 different mash bills, which means there's 10 samples we're going to be tasting as we go through the evening. Now, the first thing I have to say is that there's obviously a large volume of spirit, and it is very important that we get through the full set of tasting this evening. First thing I do want to say is that all the samples are at what we would call casking strength, so it's 63% alcohol or 126 proof. And so we do ask you to consume, if you are imbibing with us this evening, do consume with moderation. As it'll be quite probably the longest tasting in terms of alcohol spirit that I've ever undertaken. I don't know about you, Michael, but it's definitely going to be a very enjoyable one, but one to I hope we all are feeling great at the end of as well. One thing I do want to say is that this will be somewhat of a longer tasting just because of the sense of the fact that having so many mash bills and there's so much information to get through. That means that for these tasting panels, we do want to make sure that we get through all of the samples and the definitions of each of them in terms of the production processes, as well as the historical relevance of them as well with Fionnán when he joins us on screen. So we will be taking some questions, but the majority of questions will be held to the end, in which point we'll have an open forum for you to talk to both Michael and Fionnán about the different intricate aspects of the mash bills, their history, where Fionnán found them, what archives, how Michael distilled them. But the majority of questions will be held to the end just to ensure a smooth running order, because even with a short amount of time allotted to each mash bill, the time adds up very quickly. As I said, my name is Matt Healy. I'll be hosting. I'm joined by Michael Walsh, the head distiller from Boann Distillery. As I said, Fionnán O'Connor, PhD candidate, historian, and author, will be joining us as well, who is the historical mastermind behind the program. And then I do want to say a very big thank you to the Cooney family, who are the owners and operators of Boann Distillery. Without them, not only would these the fantastic pack that I hope every one of you has, that wouldn't be a concept, but the fact that they put their hard-earned money and thoughts and confidence behind this project as well to undertake something like this. So a very, very big kudos to them. Michael, I said welcome to you. How are you doing?
Very good. Absolute pleasure to be here. Yeah, excited now to get talking about this. It's a project that we undertook in the depths of winter last year, and then for one reason or another, I've had to keep somewhat secret what exactly we did, which we'll probably touch on as we get on. But yeah, it's exciting to finally be able to share all of this work with everyone tonight.
Absolutely, and as you said, is a funny project because it was a terribly kept secret in terms of what we were doing, but we needed to keep the details, the exact details of the mash bills under wraps for the purposes of not to contaminate data for Fionnán's PhD research. So many people will know that he had a sensory analysis tasting with over 30 flavor creators, where they did master blenders, distillers across the country, one in Belfast and one in Dublin, and that needed to be entirely blind, and that very much had to bring through a lot of that research without contaminating people's, if someone knew it was a 1908 whatever waterside mash bill, then people would automatically have a data skew looking for that. So we appreciate that a lot of people have been asking about this, excited about this. There was a social media embargo for people who got the packs, and it was respected by all. So we really appreciate that. But now, as you said, Michael, something fantastic to be able to talk about.
Yeah, like it was such Look, for Fionnán has been waxing lyrical about this for 10 years. It's been one of the projects that I've been most excited, probably on a professional level, the thing that's most excited me in my professional career to be involved in. And then, not to be able to speak about it for so long was such an unusual thing. But if you were part of if you see what went into the tasting in Dublin during the week or Belfast last week, there was so much detail gone into keeping absolutely every sample blind, so that the respective analyzers, if that's the correct word, were completely impartial and blind to what they were tasting. But I'd like to take this opportunity as well to thank each and every one of those. We got pretty much a resounding yes in response from every distiller or blender that we asked to join us. Unfortunately, due to COVID reasons, there was a lot of delays and pushbacks where events were organized for tasting panels, and for one reason or another that I don't have to go into. As you can imagine, they were delayed right up until this week. But still, very few people. In fact, nobody said no, they wouldn't come. I don't think it was just a thing like that. With rearranging it ended up clashing with other plans. But to get near on 30 of the most respected and most qualified people in the industry here in Ireland, and some in from the UK as well, to analyze this spirit and to be able to fully categorize it into so it's not just me and Fionnán waxing lyrical about how brilliant they all are, that we actually had some critical analysis as well, was fantastic and very much appreciated. It was absolutely humbling for me, and I'm sure Fionnán will echo that, to have your work, to be able to present something like this to the broader industry, and hopefully now, after all of this, once the secrets are now we're now tell everybody, including the broader public tonight, and hopefully everyone in the industry. Hopefully it's hopefully there's a couple of interested people that are on and are inspired tonight, or inspired already to undertake this, and we did a lot of learning ourselves here in Boann as to how the project would work out, and hopefully we can pass those learnings on to the broader industry to help properly resurrect many of these styles of brewing and indeed distillation.
Well, this is, as you said, it's a project that started in, I suppose, shrouded in a bit of secrecy, but now, as you mentioned, Fionnán is very much opening this up to the wider industry, and it's a delight to be able to, I suppose, showcase at least Boann's interpretation of what these mash bills from across the history of the country showcase, or I suppose what they taste like as well. I know Fionnán's PhD has correlated and gathered tons of information from across the history of Irish whiskey, and that will be made public to the industry at large, to anyone who really wants to read it. And knowing Fionnán will be certainly in depth. But as I said, Fionnán will be joining us in a minute. I know that we are live on all the platforms right now. I do want to apologize, I suppose, to people who are watching through the Belfast Whiskey Week link. I know we're live at this point, so we're firing on all cylinders. So I'm happy to report that. For those of you who do have the packs, I suppose a quick look at what we'll be imbibing through. And one of the great things, I know there was these were hotly anticipated. So this is the outer case of our vintage mash bills kit. Each numbered, but very much laying on unlocking the secrets of mash bills in Ireland. So we have a fantastic depiction of the Louderton in Boann Distillery, and then a now empty kit here for the tour glass, and also the tasting cards as well. So for those who have the kit with you, of course, feel free to imbibe along if you want to. For those watching back, this is a great moment to have a glass beside you. And for those who the kits are on the way, of course, I hope you enjoy this, and if you wish to watch back as well after the fact. But Michael, I mentioned in the beginning that the kind of the Cooney family put a lot of their confidence behind this project, but people might not really understand, I suppose, what that looks like. Can you give an idea from your end? What does, like, Fionnán literally took over the distillery for the guts of nearly 2 months. Can you highlight kind of what it changed the running order, it changed everything we're distilling? Can you give us a little background or insight into into really what the kind of engagement was from the distillery side.
Yeah, well, we're a pot still whiskey distillery first and foremost, and are now in 24/7 production of our own mash bills, which maybe aren't too dissimilar to some of the mash bills we may taste tonight. But yeah, we have our own house mash bill, we have our own production targets, and so on. But what was involved, and I'll get into more detail as the night progresses. But yeah, Fionnán came to us with these 10 mash bills tonight. I think in total there was about 13 or 14 if you include some controls that were needed for the analysis last Tuesday. But it was a case of production in a distillery, everything to produce different mash bills, to produce different distillations. There's a whole host. There's I won't say quite a million, but there's certainly in the thousands of different options that you have around temperature, timings, mill set points, fermentation times, distillation temperatures. But yeah, Fionnán isn't necessarily. Fionnán's a great historian, but isn't necessarily a great brewer or distiller. But what he was able, or what was insistent on, was that we had to completely produce each and every one of these as identically as possible. So any brew method that we used for mash bill 1 was identical right through the other 10, any distillation method, any fermentation time. So yeah, there was a lot of, there was probably more time, well, not quite more time, but certainly a lot of time put into preparation to get everything so that it was in a controlled manner. When I heard, and over the years, when I'd have spoken about with Fionnán as he discovered these mash bills, even pre his PhD, you'd think about, okay, I'd love to do this distillation and distill it this way or ferment it that way or whatever. But it was imperative for the sake of this PhD that the only differences would be the actual mash bill or the grain makeup. So the differences, as you'll see on the little bottles, you have your percentages of grains that were used in each one, and so that is the only difference from one mash bill to another. And so a certain mash method or brew method might be more suited to one mash bill over another, or you might brew oats slightly different to you would malt or so on. But we had to try and find a happy medium before that. And I suppose the most stressful part was we had to find that happy medium before we began. And once we set out on a particular journey or with a particular brew method, we could then not deviate from that, so that somebody couldn't turn around at the end of it all and say, well, the reason that this tastes different to this is because you added this temperature stand or you fermented for longer or so on. So yeah. So
just to briefly jump in, so scientifically the point was that between all these 10 distillates, absolutely nothing changed except the percentages in the grains.
The percentages of the grain and the days of the week, that was about it.
So like down to minute stuff like transfer rates they had to be the same, flow rates, the fermentation times had to be the same, the yeast types were used, even when you're looking at grains, it perhaps didn't need more extra stands. They got them in some cases because they had to be the exact same as other brews. And one thing I suppose I found most interesting being an enthusiast and working with you was the cut points had to be adjusted and held constant in case of decreased yields, which I found very interesting. Now, it didn't come to pass that it was needed, but it was a piece of the minutiae, I suppose, that I found very interesting. That, you know, from a technical point of view, you know, there was a lot of forethought put into what could have happened, you know.
Yeah, look, I'll probably get into more detail as the night progresses about each individual aspect. But yeah, for just on that, the cut points, if you think, for example, well, it all stems from your original brew. So if you have a very low yield of fermentable sugars, you'll have a very low ABV fermentation or a low alcohol percentage on your fermentation. If you put a low a standard wash would be up around 8% alcohol, but if you put in something at 4% into a wash still instead, it won't distill the same way as an 8%. And so you take that low wines off that wash still, you put it into your intermediate distillation, it will distill slightly different. So when you start to introduce cut points on an intermediate or spirit distillation, if the ABV has gone in at a lower ABV, it will come out at a lower ABV. And so when detailing or setting out cut points, you wanted to be confident, you wanted to back yourself and to say, well, and we had faith in ourselves that we were going to be able to brew these to over 7%. The washes or the wort into about a 7% alcohol beer or wort, but there's always and that would distill a certain way, true. But if we didn't get that, you kind of wanted, there was many that tried advising us or warning us or telling us that we weren't going to achieve that goal. And so if you're not going to achieve that goal, then you're going to end up having to make different cutting points on the particularly on the spirit distillation. So we cut all of these at 76% alcohol, but in realistic terms, that was a bit ambitious, because if we had lower yielding brews, they would have given us lower yielding distillations across the board that would not have been, simply the heads cut wouldn't have happened. So the tails cut was at 76, but the heads wouldn't have even been at that. So it begins at a higher level of ABV, and we would have simply never achieved that 76. And so if you would be tasting mash bill 8 or 9 and they were distilled differently, well, then of course they're going to taste differently. But thankfully, I can say there was very little, due to a lot of the steps and the preparation that we went and put in and the thought process and all the consultation that we took, that but most of it from guys like Alex and Cullum and Ludo and all the guys in the team, we put our heads together and we came up with a brew method that we were confident in, and our confidence was repaid. We thankfully got fairly consistent yields right across the board, but every single minute detail had to be thought out well in advance, because under normal production processes you kind of roll with the punches, and if you're not getting, if something's not working out, you change it, you mix it up. But we couldn't do that once we got into the project, and typically wisely or foolishly, we left the more difficult brews till the last. But of course it could have also scuppered the whole project if we ended up getting 2 or 3 brews or 2 or 3 mash bills at the very end that wouldn't have that just simply didn't work out. But thankfully that's not what happened, and we've 10 excellent distillates. And we had a long, was it 8 or 10 weeks of 7-hour days and 12-hour day, or 7-day weeks and 12-hour days. But thankfully all that hard work was repaid in the quality of the distillate that we produced out of it.
Fantastic. Well, before we get too far into the technical side, I do want to introduce the man who made this all possible, Mr. Fionnán O'Connor, who will be joining us on screen now. Welcome, Fionnán. You've a much more marvelous backdrop than either of us.
Yeah, gilded halls of the Duke of York in Belfast.
Exactly. Well, I suppose, Fionnán, welcome. You've been hearing everything that Michael's been saying up to this point. It's a distilling enterprise to be able to distill all of these distillates so consistently, holding all variables equal apart from the grains. Why don't I'm eager to get the first drop into people's hands. So maybe if I invite people just to maybe put a little bit in the glass, just so we have something to nose on. But Fionnán, do you want to give us a quick introduction to why this project happened?
Yeah, I mean, as Michael already said, I've been working on a doctoral thesis for a good while now on the history of Irish whiskey mash bills. And most of that is a history thesis. And then at the tail end, there's the kind of the fun stuff, which is what we're doing now, which is trying to apply that past and recuperate some of the kind of the logic of all these lost distilleries. Not just cherry pick the mash bills, but try and cherry pick a spread of them that illustrate, again, a lot of, how would you put it, the context, between them. What happens when oats go up? What happens when wheat goes down? All this stuff that's become a mystery because everybody who made it is dead. And that was where you guys came in, and thankfully you're not dead. And we can build from there.
Exactly. So, we've been talking about the fact that you trawled through archives and tax records in the public office or office in Northern Ireland, public records office, and in the UK and Ireland. There's mash bills been found in small folk culture museums in West Cork. The mash bills tend to pop up everywhere, and I am just eager to at least get the liquid to lips at the beginning, perhaps. So the J.A. Nettleton survey, which is our mash bill number 1, I suppose, give us a quick background of where you found this and what you expected, and perhaps we can have a taste and see what we've ended up with.
Yeah, and I just want to say up front, I mean, there's a lot of uses of phrases like discover or trawl or this. There's nothing special about me. I just, this is all public resource stuff for the most part. And if anyone's curious, happy to give you the, just the boring part of sitting through all the stuff that turns out to be useless. It can be kind of a fishing expedition. But this was relatively early on. So J. Nettleton is quite a big figure. He wrote a book called The Manufacture of Whiskey and Plain Spirit. And he also was the head of the Inland Revenue Department in the UK at the time. And he had publications from earlier. So in 1893, he visited distilleries in Ireland and he listed a string of mash bills. They're anonymous. They're not named. And then he gives rough proportions, but he was a very kind of strong touchstone. There's 2 names that are going to come up a lot: Nettleton and Morewood, who were both taxmen, and they were real kind of foundation stones for me. And when we were picking these mash bills, we had to make sure that we created again a context where we could examine things, but also, keep them. How would you put it? As unique as possible to each other. Some of them are relatively close, some of them are very far away. But this one is the closest, I would argue, or one of the closest to what we think of as pot still, and it's a great place to start. Because when we think of pot still now, we think primarily of Middleton, really, and people who are coming on tap now making a Middleton-like mix. The core Middleton mash is roughly 60% raw barley, 40% malt, or in that neighborhood. And this has 60% raw barley in it. So I was curious about this one because, again, it gives us, again, an anchor from which, because some of the stuff we're going to try tonight it's all pot still, it's all raw barley and malt, but mixed with other stuff, and it can get quite strange and exotic. But for me, this was a good place to start. What we're not having tonight are the controls. So yeah, as Michael mentioned, we had 60-40 distilled in the same parameters as well, and 50% malt and raw barley as well, and they were entered into the blind sensory analysis to give context to what we're talking about and see what happens when you add in the adjuncts in the first place, and they'll be going off to the lab for the same reason. But anyway, the 60-40 benchmark, the real control is roughly model off of trad pot. It's a Talesier cut, triple distillation, large big stills, and not too dissimilar, not just to modern trad pot, but to a lot of the antecedent distilleries, in the most recent period to us, the old, again, methodologies of B. Daly and Powers and so forth. But anyway, giving it a smell, and I'm almost, in retrospect, again, it would have been cool to throw in a sample without the oats, but you'll just have to take our word for it that even a small addition of oats, it turned on a lot of bulbs. It was amazing how different it was as soon as it came in. But here, again, you're looking at that control, and it's just been adjusted from 60 raw barley, keeping that the same and taking 10% out of malt and giving it to oats instead. So anyone who's ever had heavy pot distillate from any number of places, it does smell reminiscent. But go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say one thing I think people might be interested to learn about is the oats didn't quite do what you and I and Michael expected them to do.
Yeah. I mean, it's strange. And I always thought, it would be like oatmeal stout. You kind of expected it to be really texturally big and, fattening and creamy. And it does have a textural effect that we'll, discover shortly. But yeah, it was a completely different sensation, and we'll get into it. But it was that weird like top note. I didn't expect him to be so sweet, and to have that again like grace note over the rest. But give it a smell. And again, I gave myself, shorthand phrases for these that aren't in the thesis, but I remember peach fuzz and floor polish was how I used to remind myself about this one. But it does have that weird, like, fuzzy, again, and I've talked about this in some of the old distillates. In fact, we were talking in the pre-70s Belfast Whiskey Week box about that weird, like, apricot peach fuzz smell. And this, it has that same, like, almost like felt tipped smell. It's fruit, but it's not fresh fruit. It's like decayed, felt tipped, and then you get again that oil, and the oil is unmissable, and that's the raw barley.
I tell you what, Fionnán, no marketing department would ever say you're not honest. Some fantastic tasting notes, and if anyone does have the cards in front of you, the tasting notes on the bottom are all Fionnán's own hand. Although the tasting notes that Fionnán gave us for the full 10 mash bills was possibly one of the most amazing and hilarious parts of whiskey history I've ever read. And unfortunately, we couldn't put them all on here, so perhaps we'll have to put them up on the website or something later on just to get the full experience. And for anyone that is tasting at home, I know we won't be able to get into the comments and questions too much just to keep the flow, but do let us know in the comments what you're thinking. I'm seeing Phil Crawford saying he's tasting peach melba and cream soda on the nose, which is, I think, absolutely on point. And Fionnán, one of the things you touched on there was that we've just taken 10% from the malt in terms of a 60-40 mash bill or a 40-60 mash bill. One of the things that I suppose I was surprised about is I never, when we started the project, but when I was sitting there in boardroom having discussions about it, the idea of increasing 10% oats was great and exciting, and I never really considered that it took away something and what that would have an impact on the spirit. And you mentioned that there was a control of the 40-60, and did it differ in an unexpected way in your opinion or in Michael's opinion?
Yeah, I suppose I'll put it this way. I was more surprised by some of the others early on than I was by this one, because despite being number one, we did it a little ways in, and again, it has that raw barley touchstone, and it reminds me a lot of what I love about pot still in the first place. And of course, these are all bound into a 30-30-30 parameter. Nothing goes above, so mash bills, it should be said up front, mash bills varied in the past. You're not dealing with exact percentages, you're dealing with hundredweight sacks. And with some of these archives, you get the sense on some days, suddenly it's missing something, probably because it wasn't there. But at the same time, there is quite a clear sense of kind of house practice. So we made sure everything had to be decimalized, and they go up in specific percentages. So, 30% is also, it became an incidental test run for, what pot still looks to be changing to legally now, which was great. So we're discovering that kind of modern capability, and of course we couldn't do it in pure theory. We couldn't push up rye to 30% because it never was that high. So it's a combination of history and practical framework, but we had to pick mashes that fit within that 30-30-30 parameter, and try and explore that as best we could. And oats is done in real detail, and we'll see go from 5 to 10 to 15, etc. But for me, this one above all of them really had that touchstone of like licorice, must, oil, the things that made me fall in love with pot still in the first place. And I think Philip mentioned cream soda, and for me, and we'll see the like oats. Again, there's a weird like frosting vanilla that oats inject into anywhere they appear. And here, for me, it just works so well with that oil, where you're turning like the kind of like Bassett's all sorts, into cream soda. You're turning ginger beer into cream soda kind of thing, but it still has that ginger as well in the mouth. It's fat stuff. The texture is fleshy, and it just must. And I say this as a full compliment. It's like old rug smell. And I love that about some pot still distillate, that it's not fresh and fruity. It's not citrusy, delicate and airy. It's hefty. It's perspiring copiously. And again, I was, at this point, we had gone far enough that I was starting to kind of re-recognize pot still from a distance when we were on the back of some of the weirdy stuff. But I think that is such a spine of it. And again, that 10% oats, I think I was curious, and I know I had to make a presentation to because this one was added in late, but as to which one we should pick, because it hadn't been part of the original decision. And seeing, I think that was a big lesson Michael and I talked about, was how important raw barley was. We were excited about all the exotic fruits, of the past, but reminding or constantly re-encountering just how cool a flavor raw barley actually is. And I wanted to see if we could pick a mash that would keep that high. And a lot of the classical era mash bills, raw barley was quite high. It was always higher than malt, almost consistently. And again, this mash from that era, the 1890s, is really the golden age of Irish pot still. When we think of Irish pot still's history, we're thinking about Victorian Irish pot still. So it was such a touchstone, but it also had these flavors that reminded me both of like heavy pot still new make that you see now, and also things that are missing from contemporary distillates that you see in the 60s. Again, that weird like apricot-y, again, peach fuzz kind of must. But yeah, it was for me, it was almost like a coming home after straying into other stuff,
Yeah, I mean, I see Irina in the comments on the Belfast Whiskey Week portal saying that these descriptions are killing her, and I feel I always have to kind of asterisk. I once worked with people who were afraid of putting the word tannins on a description for a whiskey, and I think many companies would have a marketing department that would run a mile from the word old rug smell. But I think most people, at least hope watching this, are enjoying Fionnán's very apt, but also very honest descriptors as well. And
I must say it was one of the more enjoyable parts. Well, maybe in a different way, they could have taken it as insults, but we would start the brews every morning at 6 o'clock, and the distillations from the previous day, and so on, would be coming. So by 11, 12, 1 o'clock, you'd have something coming off the still, a new distillate to discover, and invariably it would. The afternoon would turn into a tasting session with Fionnán and discussing, and yeah, some of the tasting notes I remember a slap of a stinging nettle without the sting, and what I imagine cocaine would taste like if it had a taste, and there was everything from the wildest imaginations that you could have. But it was it was refreshing after a day spent worrying about beta glucans or anything else to come back and hear some of these crazy tasting notes that came with it.
So Michael, from your point of view, and I'm keeping an eye on time, but from your point of view, I suppose the same question to Fionnán, did you find a big, I suppose, experience, and we'll see with mash bill number 2, but when you take away 5 or 10% of one grain to give to another, did it make a huge difference in the flavor profile, or did it make it, perhaps on the other side, did it make a bigger difference than you were expecting?
Yeah, so that was one of the biggest learnings, I think, was the fact that you focused often on, we're increasing oats, but of course you have to take it from something else, and it wasn't necessarily just the addition, but the relationship. And this might not best. This is probably one of the more extreme examples because it's the highest barley content and the lowest malt content. So it's one of the more extreme examples. But we could see that coming down the tracks when you start. You could see patterns developing, and that was one of the. Certainly, I was not envisaging the relationship or being as excited about the relationship between raw barley and. I wanted to see what oats did. I wanted to see what rye did. I wanted to see what wheat did. But equally, if not more important, was the relationship between it and the other grains. So here, your barley was is where you got a lot of that dense viscosity, and that's started even when it gets, and that spryness that started to get, like when on this extreme level, like Fionnán said, the gingeriness turned into almost like a felt tip pen, or it turned into like these real licorice, these real like clove, like more extreme tasting notes. But that was one of the and it was one of the more enjoying things that it suddenly all started to make sense as well. You could see pattern develops. You could kind of predict what was going to happen when you added oats and took from malt, and added oats and took from barley, which is, I think, the whole purpose of the project from a production point of view, was to learn. It wasn't just to learn singly, okay, what does this mash bill taste like? But the mash bills I'm most excited about doing off the back of this are mash bills that aren't even covered within the portfolio that we're tasting tonight. But I have a very confident idea that, okay, if I put together this mash bill that has this ratio of barley to malt and this little bit of oats and whatever in relation to each other, what kind of a flavor characteristics you're going to get from it. So no, it was a fascinating project from start to finish.
And I think that touches very much on what Fionnán mentioned at the beginning, that it was seeing why these practices existed, you know, and Fionnán, it's hard to explain now, but Fionnán's it chose a lot of the mash bills that we use, because obviously Fionnán, you know, you're a man, a studious man who's found many a mash bill, but the mash bills had increasing increments of various grains. So we tried, you know, a 5, 10, 15 or whatever it might be of oats and wheat, and then their interactions with each other in various quantities. So it was a very interesting project from that sense, that you were able to see not only, as Michael said, what they tasted like, but why they were doing that. And I know, Fionnán, you mentioned at the very beginning, you know, why did oats hang around for so long in 5%? Was it a filter bed that most people assume, or was it because they actually had, even in small quantities, had such a great impact on flavor that they were kept for more non-practical but more aesthetic or sort of flavor points?
Yeah, and I mean, I think the second spirit will provide a good reference for that, because that's the lower. Again, it's modeled off of exactly that context. The place that we're using it as a filtration bed, and I think that was the first one we distilled after the controls, and that was such a huge shock that even 5% oats was effective, you know, and was and clearly different. But yeah, this last one, again, it's the last thing I'd say about it is it does have that gingery crackle, and again, there was mention of cream soda once more. It's almost like, you know, there's still that ginger beer, like cut, you know, a lot of pot still. It's not meant to be, again, like fruit forward. It has that strange, again, oiliness, weight, and then this crackle, and it does crackle, and that licorice is a part of that Bassett's flavor, but also that like ginger beer sensation, and I absolutely adore that. And with that sweetness from the oats, which turned out to be what oats do, it really turns that ginger beer into like cream soda ginger beer, if that could ever exist. Here I am in Belfast, the city that patented ginger ale, you know, so it's not just a big, I think there's mirrors for it somewhere, Cantrell and Cochrane, a little bit of trivia.
Well, perhaps maybe a good opportunity to move on to mash bill number 2, if that's all right with you. So we're moving from the J.A. Nettleton's 1890s survey, which was, just to remind everyone, 60 barley, 30 malt, and 10 oats. And now we're moving to what you've dubbed the ancestor to the 4060 single pot still mash bill, which is a 1908 through 1974. There are two different reference points, if I'm not mistaken, with 55 barley, 40 malt, and 5 oats. So do you want to give us a little talk on where this came from and what it is, and then I'll start filling my glass with mash bill number 2.
Yeah. I'll just clean that glass out.
And for everyone at home, you know, this is a good opportunity to let us know what you thought of mash bill number 1, if you haven't already. And do add some water if you're so inclined. I'm seeing people in the comments sections who are adding water and exploring more spice and more anise, more of that kind of licorice flavor that Fionnán was talking about. So this is mash bill number 2. They are all 63%. So just a reminder, if you like the cast strength whiskies or you're used to tasting cast strength, it might be perfect for you. But of course, as I always say, as long as you pay for it, drink it whatever way you want. So if you like to cut it 50-50, by all means. But Fionnán, please.
Well, and of course, when we were first drinking them, we were extremely lax. I mean, it was coming off at still strength, and Michael and I we probably wasted an awful lot of spirit, to be honest. You know, cutting it down ourselves and thinking, oh, that's gotten very watery, and chuck that out. Oh, we have to do it again, blah, blah, blah. And so I think we've tasted like every conceivable spirit strength there is. But
diligence there, Fionnán. That's what we're committed to the cause.
I know. And but anyway, so this mash, and it's a funny one because the filtration thing comes up, and you know, it's old history now, but it used to annoy me when some people said, oh, there was oats and it was only a filtration, it was very small. Of course, the research showed that it's not true. But there were distilleries where it was very small and was most likely used as, you know, there in a functional purpose. But there are other functional purposes that have come up, and I'll touch on those later. But anyway, my question, one of my early research questions was, did Irish whiskey simplify into a common mash bill, or was it just the industry collapse and, what survived? And was the 5% oats the tail years? But it wasn't, as the 1908 references from Watercourse Distillery, who did use about 5% oats. And of course, it was also used in the antecedent just before the coming on tap of New Middleton, the old Middleton distillery. So if you drink like Dungourney or this stuff, it's around like 47% oats. And so there is that consistency. So it's not that they became the one. It was that this runs through the history. And then I ended up finding, subsequently, I found an old Cork Distillers Company mash record that someone hadn't, it was in a private archive that someone hadn't turned back to the library. It had, it was a never returned book, but it had, North Mall, etc., and was clear that there had been that consistency within Cork Distillers. So again, they existed in parallel with each other. So yes, it explains some of the history and what some people did, but it does not explain the entirety of the history. Nevertheless, it's funny, like when you're setting off the cask, I know this will be the last to say because it's the one that's, the smallest adjunct, but it was so fun to see that happen. But again, like I think the phrase used to us was infuriatingly good, because it showed how, even with just a little bit, you actually do get flavor. Whereas we've been telling people for ages that, you can't get any flavor with just 5%. But so you're forced to eat my words. But when you smell it, there is that weird, like, again, just 5% oats, and you get that frosting. If there was one question when we had the blind panel, that one of the categories is sweetness, synthetic or non-fruity sweetness, so stuff like vanilla, glycerin, that kind of stuff, and that's bang on what oats seem to add to this. That weird like caster sugar, icing, wedding cake, this like thin, glycerin-y, vanilla-y sweetness, and this one for me has it in space. And this is the one that I described as the like coke addicts knows, the strange like vanilla powdery smell. And I'm sure like if there was a smell to that sense of addiction, this would be it. That again, that like weird mix of like crackle and caster sugar. But the nose is so fun. It's so refreshing. Again, you have, and it still has 55% raw barley, so it is quite high. It's the second highest raw barley content after the previous one. But for me, there is that weird like crackle, that mix of the like ginger snap crackle and that vanilla create this like incredibly fun, it's almost like you're smelling it through 2 centimeters of icing, and then underneath there's citrus, and you just can't get to it, that kind of crackle, that ginger and citrus just under the, but it's so hard to get past that wall of frosting, of icing.
I think this is an example as well, if you compare it to the last one, where there's only on the surface of it, it only looks like small changes, but one of the biggest changes, or one of the biggest differences, is the closing in the gap between malt and barley. So the gap between the level of malt in the first versus is over 30%. This one is only 15%, and on what we found, there was a couple of things from a brewing point of view. Once you started to go down below your 40% malt, you obviously got into more difficulties, because you have less of your diastatic power from your enzymes in your malt. But a lot of the level of sweetness was almost controlled by the malt. If you had more malt, you would sweetness a bit, but the shape of that sweetness, if that makes sense, the oats built on and turned it into this, like Fionnán said, like this caster sugar dusting. It turned it into citrus, like sherbet, in different examples we'll taste later. But you can see that we were looking at, what will 5% oats do? But it's also that relationship where we took a small step back on the barley as well and gave a little bit more power to the malt. The malt didn't have a massively outrageous flavor profile and compared to maybe the other ones, but it did maybe help, obviously, on a production point of view, on the diastatic power. But it also, I think it started to bring forward more mainstream ideas of sweetness compared to your first, which is it's a very different whiskey, that first sample.
Yeah, and there is that weird, like when you taste it, there's still a high raw barley content in there. And you get this weird, like for me, it's almost like gingerbread. You know, there's this weird, like a lot of them have a weird soda bread kind of characteristic as well. But that like baking powder thing that the oats do, baking powder, castor sugar, you know, again, this kind of fluffy sweetness. When you get it with the ginger, it feels like, you know, one of those like sticky toffee pudding desserts. You know, they're like gingery things in ice cream kind of sensation. Because even the smell, like there is that weird, like sherbet or you know, vanilla ice. You know how the posh vanilla ice cream is, or ice cream is yellow. The French vanilla. I've never quite understood what French vanilla actually is, other than, you know, a different shade of vanilla ice cream. Is it a type of vanilla? I don't know. But anyway, this smells a lot like it. And you still have that, again, that like oil. But then when I said like oats didn't do what we expected them to do, they didn't create that like heavy texture. They still create a like almost like a dairy fat texture. There's that weird like cream puff sensation when you're eating, you know, like you're bitten into kind of some sort of puff pastry. That kind of lipidy, you know, again, whole fat cream, you know, ice creamy, you know, gelato kind of feeling. And again, it works well with the oil for starters, but it also works really well with the ginger.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's one of the trends that we'll start to know. Like one of my biggest learnings was keeping the distance between malt and barley by 10% or more. You kept a lot of those oils that Fionnán was talking about there. You could build in that sugar dusting with the oats, but it kept that classical. Once you kept over that 10%. The distance between malt and barley, you kept those oils and that richness, that traditional pot still or traditional heavy pot still style came true, and it's still that character is still true, but even just a subtle introduction of oats or change in the oats has altered its the flavors that it manifests itself as.
Yeah, and it's funny. Yeah, oh, go on.
No, I was just going to say, for everyone at home, I see a few people dropping in comments about if you're tasting along with us, what you're tasting as well. I said it's very interesting to see the reactions of people at home, and these cards do give you all the information in terms of the mash bills over here, as well as the information where they came from, and Fionnán's tasting notes down here as well. But please, Fionnán, fire away.
Oh, I was just going to say, you know what it reminds me of? Did you ever have Murphy's brown bread ice cream? Reminds me, that's what I was talking about, like ginger sticky toffee, but that isn't it at all. It's that weird mix of like soda bread and vanilla and ice cream, you know, and that to me is a big part of that, like what oats seem to do with higher raw barley, as Michael was saying. You know, if you keep both high, you end up with this weird like baker's bread meets ice cream, and it works. You know, it still has that like dusted, again, like sugary, you know, powder sugar sweetness, but it also has that ginger from the oil, and it also has this like, again, like milk fat cream, and there's different textures. And when we were doing the thesis panel, a big part, you know, part of it was tracking texture and seeing if we could, you know, if it would texture increase with different mash bills. But it's such a flawed methodology because there's so many different textures at play. You know, it's not just one texture and it's get heavier or lighter, and oats do seem to give that like weird, you know, milk lipidy kind of, you know, lip licking kind of sensation. But it was fun stuff, you know, and it works. Yeah, and again, even that texture works well with the oil.
Absolutely. I do see some questions coming through about cask to be laid down in obviously a different end of the project than your end, Fionnán. Very much an examination of the new make spirit. We I suppose as a distillery did lay down all of the spirits in bourbon, rum, Neoc, which is a rejuvenated French wine cask, as well as sherry or Oloroso hogsheads. And they were very particularly chosen as well to kind of reflect. There's not really a single type of barrel that everything went into at one point, but we did rely on, I suppose, Fionnán, some of your finds in the different archives and industrial archives about barrels that would have been used. Rejuvenated French wines that came up, quite a number of rums. Obviously, the most famous being the Oloroso sherry, and then bourbon for kind of a more. Some of these would have gone into bourbon, but more recent kind of a testing ground as well for maturation. But I say the one cask that I do wish we've been able to get our hands on. I know you found records of was it port cask with rum heads, or was it rum cask with port heads?
But yeah, I mean, and I can send that on. That was from it was a London company selling into Tullamore Dew, and their the purchase records, and of course and it was fun to try. There is a lot of motley stuff from the past. There's a lot of reference to rejuvenating oak, to promises that it will taste like new oak. The effect will be so whatever was in it, but also they kind of even romantically touch on the three, if you look at the history of drinks in Ireland, first of all, consumed a lot more red wine than Britain, funnily enough. Less sherry and more just Bordeaux. Huge, deep links. Even at the peak of sherry's popularity, Ireland has a very, very old tie to Bordeaux. And again, there's just a massive debt there, massive story there. And then rum. Look, rum outsold whiskey in Ireland for the first half of the 1700s. Rum. One argument I've had to make is, why did gin never take off in a big way in Ireland in the way that it did in England? And the best answer that I've come up with is that just rum was filling its place. That you had this like wash of cheap alcohol, because essentially, and it's to do with separation of tax systems. Ireland had very restrictive internal excise and very liberal customs excise, whereas in the period we're talking about just after the Williamite Wars, there was a heavy restriction on imported spirits coming into England, which was part of, and a huge laxing of regulation on distilling, which is why the gin craze happened in the first place. So there is this weird, now of course, rum did come into England as well in a big way. But it was this massive force in Ireland, in places like Cork. And it tapers out as whiskey takes its place and as whiskey starts to industrialize. But anyway, those different casks, yes, I was finding stuff in the 50s of their use, but even as a triage, they track the history of like the drinks that have rubbed shoulders most closely with whiskey in Ireland, at various points of its history. And it's fun to imagine, like, looking at this, like, I have no idea what that'll do. And, could you imagine, like, rejuvenated oak and that pixie dust thing, what'll happen there? Michael and I sat back a few times pondering, what this stuff could do in these casks, but, we have no way of knowing just yet.
Exactly. And you do touch on that, the rejuvenated red wine casks, which I was delighted to see some very interesting casks being offered to different distilleries in Ireland back in the day. But they were an interesting one because having worked with some of those casks, they tend to give kind of a creamy raspberry sweet note, which, like you said, this kind of pixie dust, what that's going to do interacting with that kind of creamy raspberry, lovely fruity note is going to be something to keep an eye on, definitely. And perhaps a good point to segue into our next whiskey, if you're happy with that, Fionnán.
Yeah.
So just to recap before we go, this is what was number 2. We're just finishing up now. This is your 1808 to 74 ancestor of the 4060, 55 barley, 40 malt, and 5 oats. And now we're segueing into number 3, which you have named the USA Pure Product Report 1916 to 55. And this time we're going up in oats and down in raw barley. So we're going to see a very different interaction in the spirit. And again, mash bill number 3, if we're not clued in up to this point. Again, 63% ABV, so I suppose drink appropriately. So Fionnán, please.
Yeah, so this is so when we start talking about why do people use oats, and of course there is that like a constant trend of some people using roughly 4 to 7% oats, but you get people using twice that and 3 times that, and a big one you see is again, like, well, we'll talk about 30% oats later on, but it's, no grain in these mashes varies more than oats, because oats were, again, for so long, the second grain of the category after raw barley. And it was the one we got to track most intimately on the result of that. So I remember we did this right after doing the 5%. We thought, wow, 5% made such a huge difference. What will 15% do? And they were more similar. It was almost like, there was a bigger leap putting in oats at all than there was raising, but it still helped us track how oats interact with spirit. And yeah, it comes from a variety of places. And a lot of these names are chosen as tags because, I try to steer people away from wondering, which distillery used which mash, because there's more of a difference over time than there is over place, and you do have variation internally and a lot of people doing the same thing in similar times. So a lot of mashes belong to more than one place in principle, and then similarly, some of them are tracking two sides of the variation. So you see oats, some people oscillate, so like when what this is roughly based off of is two things. One, it's the old Cumber distillery, or a triple distilled incarnation of that, but that was a big part of the thesis, and a vital discovery. Now Eckhamville, for anyone who saw the documentary, did a recreation of Cumber, and they double distilled it and did exactly, it's 12% specifically is the average there, whereas this is 15. And triple distilled, because again, everything has to be done in exactly shared parameters for this. But when you're looking at that mash, it's not just there. You see again this pure products report, a customs report essentially in New York of whiskey coming from Dublin. So was that Marrowbone Lane? Was that it's called Dublin whiskey, which suggests DDC, which is the old DWD Marrowbone Lane row amalgamation, and it's in 1916. But you see these, they're more about principles, and that was a huge thing about recuperating that logic. They're not just one thing here and one thing there. But it was interesting, and and again, like Cumber is a whiskey I've had before, and many people have tried, and there was that little bit of reference from the guys up in Eckhamville. It's the only mash bill, that there was reference outside of here, where Eckhamville had done there for the film project, but it was a different kit in a different still. But it was well, instead of talking about it, let's give it a smell.
Look at you, very fancy.
Like Obsidian, this year's whiskey
on
theme.
Side note, that is a stunning glass. I am very jealous that you have one in your hands. I'm going to fawn over that and try to get my hands on one. But so what are you finding on the nose in this one, Michael? Maybe I'll throw it on its head and bring you back in.
I was enjoying. I was waiting. I was waiting for how was he going to improve on his crack cocaine tasting notes. I think this is like you get your lemon sherbet. This is where you're starting to see it more clearly. What Fionnán has touched on now, the two previous. Your sherbet, like raspberry citrus, nearly like the sweetness is starting to turn it. Yes, it's still that artificial style of sweetness, but layered upon that gingeriness has started to turn into more like I said, citrus notes, raspberry notes, in red currant. Not as oily as the first two, and that's this is from the learnings that's the tracking and the reduction of the barley. And that's where I spoke about a minute ago, where the gap between the malt and the unmalted barley has closed at a lower than a 10% gap. It's down to just 5% of a difference between the two, and you start to get less of those really heavy pot still oils, but loads of that. Well, it's spryness of a different sort. It's that liveliness, that sherbet, that kind of like a raspberry sorbet kind of a flavor profile coming through from most likely the now high levels of oats.
Yeah, there is that weird, like if the first one smells like vanilla ice cream, this smells like sorbet, like thin. It's odd as oats went up, that sweetness, that caster sugar thing got thinner and more glycerin-y and more, again, like closer to sorbet than ice cream, and raspberry and these kind of high notes, it almost thinned out into a kind of a soprano falsetto version of mash bill number 2. And then there's still that weird like lemon rind kind of thing underneath the seams. It still has that, lipidy sensation, but not the oil. And, and it was a great way to, again, track like, oh, right, that oil very clearly comes from the higher raw barley content in the first two. Whereas here, you keep that, again, lip smacking kind of coating sensation, but it's lightened out that kind of weight. But absolutely surprising when it came out, because it was the first indication of what oats was doing as it was going up. It's the first, reference point on what happens when you take away from raw barley. And it was having done these two that we went back and did number one, because we were suddenly discovering, kind of getting the bearings about how this logic was working. But loads of fun. And it kind of it still crackles. It still has a very, and even the oats has a certain citrus, again, a zest more than citrus. And when you swallow, there's still there's almost like a cooking apple taste. It's a kind of a grippiness more than a zest, like granny apple, that kind of stuff. And it works well with that. Again, the nose is so light and so thin, and so, again, kind of, how would you put it? Glossy, as it were, to get that crackle, that kind of, it's still got guts at the end, but it's that green apple crackle rather than the classic ginger and licorice, and it's delivering that crackle without the kind of the normal just body wash oil that you get with pot still, at the same time. But it's fun. It's a, springtime pot still, if such a thing could ever exist, because pot still doesn't have those, big fruit flavors that unpeated malt does, but it has fruit, certainly. And I remember talking to a very eminent, now retired Irish distiller. I don't want to go name dropping him, but you can probably guess. But I remember what he said to me when I was doing the interview for the book project, A Glass of Port, back in 2012. And I asked him, what notes do you get from pot still? And one of the things that he said was unripe pear. And it was something that had never come up, in conversations with people before. And it's certainly there. But here, that interview left such a deep impression on me at the time that, I'm probably playing mind games with myself going looking for that. But that weird, green, unripe orchard fruit is such an unsung trait of the style. And here, it's still there. That weird, Granny Smith crackle, that green fruit. Everything is slightly unripe, slightly edgier. Almost again, it's that same gingery sensation, but manifesting itself into fruit. And
anyone that's interested in the slightly other end of the aspect, this was where one of our first ventures into the do not go there category of levels of oats. But thankfully we had no issues at all with that. And the issues were more from across the three. For anyone from more production minded. The first mash bill that we tasted tonight was one of our lowest yielding of the three of the 10, and the second and third, once we got up to that 40% malt, once we didn't go below 40%, we started to get fairly consistent levels of yield. But that being said, the drop off to between the highest yielding and the lowest was only 50 LPA across 50 to 60 LPA, which isn't by any stretch of the imagination a big drop off between your highest yielding and your lowest yielding. So yeah.
And Michael, I suppose a good point to ask you. You said that you're getting into the do not go there limits. Perhaps a little bit of an explanation for that be needed, but just more to the point. What was it like going in day one trying to process this level of oats? What were you worried about? What were you keeping an eye out for?
Well, the big difficulty particularly with oats, but any of the grains, really part of malt, you start getting to higher levels of beta glucan, and for any being normal everyday life where you may have heard beta glucan is in, if for your heart health, you should eat porridge because it's full of beta glucans and it's good for your heart health. But it's not necessarily good for a brewer's heart health, because when you put it into a brewing vessel, if you can imagine, when you pour hot water, boiling water into a bowl of oats, it turns into porridge. It turns into a big, gloopy, sticky mess. For a brewer, what you try to do when you pour hot water into your your grain is that you want to dissolve it, break down the internal structures, and then run off the liquid, the sugary, hopefully sugar dense liquid. So to do that, you have to get very specific temperatures. And for beta glucans, you get beta glucanases active at around 40, 45 degrees Celsius. So we basically put in a long enough stand at the very beginning. We're fortunate we have what's called an MCV, or mash conversion vessel, which can take all of the grains into the pot in one big go, and then it has a heated jacket on the outside. So we started off at our kind of like 45 degree Celsius temperature, which was a beta glucan stand, and that was mostly added in to work with these oats. We then started to go through different stand temperatures, right up to a protein stand of 55, protein rest, and your beta glucans would still be kind of, there's like ideal temperatures, and then there's temperature ranges. Your beta glucans will still kind of go to work on this kind of a temperature range, and then you start to get up with your more traditional temperature ranges for brewing, which would be around 65. This is where your main workhorse of the whole breakdown or sugar breakdowns happens with your alpha and beta amylase. So they're in your malt, and then you start to get up to 78. But having the piece of equipment that we do in Boann, which was able to heat at all of these ideal temperature ranges, meant that mash bills that were high in beta glucan, or mash bills that were not, or we were able to give the ideal temperatures for these individual little components to do their work. And so we were able to thankfully create a sugary wort, and not a big bowl of wallpaper paste, as we were warned we were about to create. So it was something to look. We did, like I said, we did awful lot of work on doing science side of things. But you then start hearing horror stories from other people who have tried it and whatever.
Is that
worked out. Yeah. Hello.
All right, lads.
We got it.
I think so. Can you hear me?
I can hear you anyway.
The wonders of live technology. Did I drop out, or did we all drop out?
I'm not sure. I don't know if I dropped out or if everyone dropped out or what happened, to be honest.
Well, look, we're back anyway. So
that's my cue to stop talking about beta glucan and get back to the whiskey.
Exactly. I suppose one thing I wanted to ask you was I'm seeing a lot of people in the comments. They're getting a lot of sweetness, a lot of the sugariness coming through as well. I suppose, were you surprised at oats have famously, I suppose, always been said that they're going to bring this big oiliness and creaminess and chewiness to the whiskey. And I think what we're seeing, at least across the first three, is that might actually be a large attribution from the barley rather than just the oats, if that makes sense. Were you surprised to see the creaminess fall off this much while keeping the flavors of the oats, Michael? I suppose I'll ask you first.
I suppose we have preconceptions that may be more attributed to the way that these grains produce the beers that these grains would produce. And so if you think of a big heavy oat stout or whatever, you kind of think, oh yeah, well, that's going to create a really oily and viscous distillate. But it was more so staring us right in the face already with the barley that created that traditional heavy oily pot still style. So yeah, that was one of the big that was probably the biggest juxtaposition. That was the one that surprised us most. It was probably the most fascinating in a lot of senses, the influence of the oats, but it was not an influence that we had necessarily predicted.
Fantastic. And you, Fionnán? The same
question?
Yeah,
I mean, again, like when we think of porridge, we think of oatmeal stout, if we think of its use in drinks. And yeah, both of those things are very thick. And of course, it's, it was a shock, and then it became, more and more stabilized as oats went up, and they weren't becoming more like what we expect. First it was because there's only 5% oats, but no, and there was this whole new spread of flavors coming out, and there is that weird, again, like lip licking sensation. There is a texture there. It's just not the texture we thought it'd be, and it doesn't seem to increase dramatically as more oats are introduced. It kind of plateaus, as opposed to raw barley, which very clearly, and then another adjunct we'll talk about later, which even more so, was as it went up, texture, changed. But yeah, oats, it was again the most detailed of the three adjuncts in terms of how many different percentages it came in, but also it was the one I think we got to know the best as a result. And yeah, it's fun, and you're always looking at the past, wondering like, why did something taste the way it did? And there's many different reasons, the distilling regimen, etc. And we tried to imitate that, a tail's ear cut, triple distilled, or a tail's ear cut of a triple distillation. But at the same time, you can never quite know, and we never get to try the new make of these times. So who knows what happens when this has been sitting in a sherry cask for 7 years? Maybe, it does start being more reminiscent of, but like a lot of these whiskeys, and a tasting note I used to use, or a texture note, there's a weird like gelatinous sensation in a lot of older Irish whiskeys. It's oily, but it's more like, again, like American Jell-O, the way like a solid thing dissolves in your mouth. And maybe this, lip smacky thing is related to that. Maybe it's a complete coincidence. We'll have to come back in 7 years and take a look again, so we can only kind of like shoot backwards at the past and wonder if we've made a connection.
That's Fionnán, you're already dictating the barrel programs now. Boann will be looking at some fantastic 7-year-old Irish whiskies coming in the line. Although it is often called the sweet spot of Irish whiskey, so I don't blame you. Perhaps a good point, maybe if we move on in our mash bills and start increasing our oat contents and decreasing our raw barley. So we were on number 3 here, so we move on to mash bill number 4, which is the What is Whiskey trial. Here's a mash bill number 4, or as you can see here, number 4. So 20 oats, 50 malt, and 30 barley, Fionnán. So where did this mash bill come from?
The What is Whiskey trial. And there's a lot there, and again, very easy to, I always get a bit queasy or cringy when Boann's advertorial team, praise my archival prowess, because a lot of it was embarrassingly easy to find. And it was almost shocking that it hadn't come up before. There was stuff that genuinely, and of course people have been very familiar to me on all fronts. But in the What is Whiskey trial, the most well-known document in the legislative history of Irish whiskey, or whiskey full stop, there's a summons, or a prominent Dublin distiller is summoned, James Talbot Power, who is talking about procedures and things that differentiate, Irish whiskey from Scotch whiskey and so forth. And then, he's talking, and the reason I picked this description, and and it doesn't even quite gel up with some of the Powers mashes from the 1800s. And again, they all did change, but in this specific one, they're talking about how high the malt content is, and he's saying that distillers in Dublin use a higher malt content. He says our policy is to use half, 50%, and then he's the judge keeps giving him figures, and he says, oh, that's a bit closer, blah blah blah. So he's giving a ballpark, but one trait that is very clear in Dublin is there's a high malt content, by which I mean 40 to 50. That would. Pot still never went above 50% malt, really, and usually it was closer to 30. In that 30 to 40 space, if not slight. Again, before older history, you're talking like 10 to 30. But anyway, it was to test, that space from that report, from that moment, high malt and high oats. So it's funny because it is quite close to the other two in its premise. It's malt, raw barley, and oats. but it's the one where the raw barley content is lowest. In fact, it never gets lower than this. It's the least raw barley-ish. It's the highest malt content, and then a heavy dose of oat. So what happens when you do, and as we were saying before, you always have to remember what you're taking away from when you're giving. So it's all three of those things. What happens when you shoot down raw barley? What happens when you bump up malt? And what happens when you get oats to 20%, to the second highest in the whole series? And if you do those three things at the same time, what comes? Because you can't do any of them in isolation. So, giving it a wee smell.
Do you have 10 glasses in front of you, Fionnán? Is that?
I have a rotating system of glassware. But they kind of, there's three different types of glasses, which is how I can kind of keep them in my head apart from each other, and only one of them is the beautiful kind of Borg whiskey glass. And
just to shed out to where you are, is it the Duke of York you're in at the moment?
Yeah, it's actually I'm staring at an old pub, two old pub mirrors for Cumber. Ask for Old Cumber, the cream of Irish whiskies. Well, that's clearly from that lipidy taste we were getting. The cream was really a valuable part of the. I might not be so bad at marketing after all. Maybe this untapped talent.
But just for anyone that is tasting along at home, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one, where, as Fionnán said, the lowest raw barley influence, highest malt, and highest oats so far. So be very interested to see what people are tasting. But Fionnán, do you want to lead us through the nose a little bit here?
Yeah. I mean, now people, I hope after the first three have a certain logic of their own, as we were kind of getting it along the way to look for. But one thing that definitely strikes me is it is sweeter, and it's sweet in a weird, like almost like tinned fruit kind of way, like tinned pear, tinned plum, that kind of stuff. There's a weird like gooiness about it. I think in those notes I originally gave you, called it outdoor wedding with a Chinese takeaway was my shorthand for it, because there's this weird like mix of like outdoorsy, grassy brambliness, and then this like sweet and sour sauce. But they were the two big standouts for me. Was that weird, like, again, grassy, brambly, but also this like goo, this like dark plum, overripe plum sauce rather than plum, and you feel like you should be like lashing it over duck or something. But it's a really odd, like a plum sauce kind of smell.
And for you, Michael, when you're not lathering ducks in outdoor weddings, what
I'm not going to get past. I actually have Fionnán's. I kept these to like Fionnán's. An outdoor wedding with Chinese takeaway, grass, dry soil, and wedding cake, pale pears, dark and syrupy aside, a plum sauce, the sweet and sour new make you might pour over a duck. That's what the
I remember that. Don't forget everything.
That's a class. No, but he's right. In a more colorful language that I could have put myself. This is where you start to see that maybe felt tip marker that we were talking at the beginning, the gingeriness of the barley take a backseat. And this is a very clear example of where we've increased the malt content, and it seems to have upped the sweetness into, like you said, like a gooey, like a tinned fruit style. But there is something, the oats is there in a very high proportion in the 20%. I think it does present itself as kind of an icing sugar, but it's nearly a background note. It's not. This is where we were going, oh my God, we're getting this. We're gone from 5, we're gone to 10. Wait until we go to 20, what it's going to do. We thought it was going to be, but it's not. It sits there, and it is definitely there. It's that icing sugar on a cake kind of an effect. But it's wrapped up in these something somewhat savory, but yeah, like tinned fruit sweetness is where you're starting to get. You're now, because this is where we're pushing the extremes. If there's an extreme within this mash bill, okay, it's an extreme on the oats, but it's also an extreme on the malt, and it's where that 10% has been flipped on its head, where now the oats is dominating the barley and has pushed its influence more to the background.
Yeah, absolutely. And I felt like that, it's the least pot stilly, shy like 70% to 30%. It's the least raw barley, allowed, coincidentally now. But you've pushed up malt, and that's sweet, and then oats are adding their different kind of non-fruity sweetness, but you get the fruit sweetness from the malt. So it is extremely different. If mash bill number 1 was a real like cornerstone for remembering that this is all essentially within the church of pot still, this is as in the dark and winding way you've wandered away from what you're kind of a long way from home when you're drinking this and calling it pot still, but it's still fun, and it'll be curious. I would love to see what that would do in sherry, or even like, I don't know, it's not part of the cask, but like port or something. It has that weird darkness of its own that can hold its weight. It'd be fun.
Yeah, I'd agree. It's it's not to be dismissive of the distilled. It's one of my favorite of the night so far, but it's one of what I might have, which I think is a very similar picture in my head of what pot still is to yourself, Fionnán, and yourself, maybe Matt as well, but not to speak for you. But yeah, it's starting to see where you start to come back the higher the malt, and you only have to go as far as 50%, and it starts to becoming that numbing kind of a sweetness. Now, I don't think there's still a lot of that pot still character still there, but considering that we can go as high as 70% malt and still call it pot still, you start to see where we're starting already to venture out of maybe your more classical pot still style, and we're only come as far as 50% on the malt.
Yeah, and it's weird. You go looking for the closest I can get to that again, looking for the pot still, looking for the raw barley content. It's almost like that kind of fleshy white peach. They're like donut peaches that don't have any taste. They're like little flat thingy-bobs. Occasionally you get lucky and they taste like something, and they taste a bit like this. They're that like weird, like fleshy white peach. It's not musty peach. It's not pale enough to be apricot. It's still peach, but that kind of like, again, like donut, odd-looking flat peach. But it's definitely there. It's just a real backseat to both. The oats, and it's almost like the oats that kind of like icing cake oats effect is even it is under pressure from the rising of the malt. I think the malt going up really made the biggest thumbprint on this whiskey. Because this is the highest oat so far, but it kind of plateaued 5:15 to 20 of what you're seeing that do. But it's also again happening in other contexts. And you don't get that weird, like Murphy's brown bread ice cream, like gingerbread and ice cream love affair between raw barley and oats, because again, the raw barley has also come down substantially from 1655 in the first one to 30, and malt has come up. And yeah, you get this weird and fruity, but not in the sense of malt. When pot still gets fruity, you just end up with like fatty, fleshy fruit, or fruit syrup, or again, like tinned fruit, the goo that holds the tinned pears together, or the tinned peaches even, that kind of like stuff I used to drink as a kid, we weren't supposed to eat, the stuff in the tin that's holding this like sugary, like saccharine pear material. Mix that with a bit of new make and you're sorted. You can recreate this stuff at home. But it does have that, again, that like, it is textural, but it's a different kind of, it's that goo. I hate using words like goo. Happy
to use old rug and cocaine.
Oh yeah.
Goo is out of the
goo, that's the line. Yeah. I suppose there's a lot of people coming through in the comments, particularly on the Belfast Whiskey Week forum here. And a lot of people very much enjoying this, and I would love to see so people who are tasting at home. We've tasted through 4 different mash bills, and we're going to go into a 5th now. And maybe as we taste the 5th, we're halfway point. I'd love to hear people's thoughts on what their favorites have been so far, and even as Fionnán pointed out, or Michael has pointed out as well, we learned internally, the different characteristic influences that different grains are giving in these influences, and I'm hoping that you'll be able to track at home. As the barley goes down, you're perhaps able to see the influences that are decreasing in the spirit as well. So it'll be very interesting to hear people at home's thoughts on what what is decreasing, what is increasing, but also what perhaps you're enjoying more of or lamenting the loss of. As we go into number 5, so this is number 4 that we're kind of tying a knot in the end of. How, I suppose, what your project required, it's for your PhD. It'll be made public. It'll be an industry resource without a doubt. Perhaps not written that way, but I assume used that way in years to come. But you needed a distillery to work with to undertake these mash bills, and I know from working internally in the distillery, it was quite often, quite funny that you essentially took over the distillery for 2 months, and we were working to you more so than any other way around. So I suppose, what was it like when producing these mash bills? As I said earlier on, the Coonies were very much rode in behind you and put a lot of their time and also their resources and a whole distillery and a team of distillers to work with you. So what was it like undertaking these mash bills in a distillery?
Yeah, well, I felt it's huge inflation of power. I was riding that high for months afterwards. Because Michael was doing all the actual, Michael and the team were doing all the actual work. So all I do is swan in and then take all the credit, having your wish is my command. 15% oats. Oh, look, this spirit. I didn't do any graft to produce, but it's coming out of blah blah blah. But no, it was first of all, it's a huge relief that nothing broke. That was my biggest worry, was that I would cock up the kit, because I know the engineering company were nervous, and as oats went up, so I was mostly a sense of relief. And again, taking up residence in that excise office or excise officer's office in the distillery was a wonderfully ironic sensation. But yeah, no, loads of fun, and it was so refreshing. And it was in the middle of lockdown, it was dark, back when we were in really severe lockdown in December and January. So it was a huge relief. It was the first time I'd gotten out of the house in a long time. So yeah, no, wonderful experience, And then Boann was so perfect for this experiment, because we needed a distillery that was nimble enough to take time off core campaigns and do this, but still large enough to have a setup of triple distilled large bulbous pots with a high enough tech setup to take consistent cuts and to ensure that these things are kept constant, and you need a certain kind of distillery to do that. So it was the kind of perfect intersection of all those, again, the mix of vision and setup and size and etc. I couldn't have, I'd always intended to do this as part of the thesis, but I never kind of cracked out how I was going to make it happen, But yeah, it was a delightful experience, one I will, treasure and remember for the rest of this box. See how we get on. Yeah.
I say, from as a whiskey lover, first and foremost, I'd say thanks to the Coonies for I suppose believing in your vision and going at it, because there's not many. I don't think there'd be many distillery owners that would look at a campaign that included multiple mash bills of 30% oats, or 30% combined wheat oats and rye in a mash bill, and think that that's exactly what we want to undertake, especially with so many engineering companies running for the hills in terms of their lack of confidence in the brewing capacity, which turned out to be unfounded, which is great. So, well,
not necessarily unfounded, but they it could have I think in fairness to, not to keep lumping on praise, but just to put some perspective on it, in the 8-week period or so that we produced these mash bills, under normal operations, we would have produced about 110,000 LPAs. We ended up producing about 40,000 LPAs in that period for Fionnán. The grains, because rye, oats, and wheat for brewing aren't necessarily grown readily at the moment, more difficult to source, more expensive to source, leaving aside the lower yields. And then you have your supplier literally telling you, if you do this, you will break your new shiny distillery and it won't work, and we're not going to stand over it. So to take the risk, leaving aside a best case scenario, you're going to have a far reduced yield at a far more expensive rate. You're adding loads of stress onto the team, which was very I was happy to absorb it, as were the team, because thankfully everybody that works at the distillery, yourself and all of the production team, the whiskey is a vocation, is a passion as much as it is a job. But like, there were stark differences. It was a big undertaking to take and a big risk, and I think the pot still whiskey category will be all the better for it. Fionnán took lots of maybe not as expensive risks having to go up, and he should be, as much as he's unwilling to accept praise, to have to trawl through records after records inside old libraries and going through old wood cardboard boxes trying to find the off chance you might find a record. That's not a task that would have been undertaken lightly, and is unlikely that would have ever happened if Fionnán and his passion hadn't done it. But he should be commended, and I'm sure everyone tonight and everyone in the industry will, for a long time after us, will be very grateful for Fionnán and his learnings and his and what we've learned from this project. But the Coonies as well, for their part. It was at great expense and at great risk to themselves, and only for their passion and their belief in Fionnán and the project and the broader picture of pot still whiskey. Like, I mean, this is the start, hopefully, or not even the start, but this was hopefully a big boost now to the broader Irish pot still category, where other distilleries will see what we've learned about. Okay, this is what happens when you do add a little bit of oats, and this is what happens when you do rye, and then you don't have to be as afraid of oats. You just have to put in a beta glucan stand, and you're able to get all of this icing sugar character from it. And in 7 years' time, or 10 years' time, or 20 years' time, we'll have a far more exciting, and we won't have to be reminiscing of what was there in the past, but what is there to look forward to, from not just from Boann, but from all of the other dare I say, 30 or 40 distilleries that are on the island, or how many of them will venture into. But hopefully this will encourage a few more to join in what is a very exciting category of whiskey.
Yeah, and I mean, it's exciting times, and it was great to see that kind of love from the trade. You know, nobody was paid to sit on that panel. They were all volunteers. We had 26 panelists. There was, up and down the country, distilleries taking an interest. And I'll spend the rest of the year, stacks of data of just loads and loads of responses of the questions and this and that. And again, the whole hope is that, they can take these and go home and make their own stuff. And that, the thesis is only as influential as they choose to make it. But we are at this exciting time. And of course, this is all within one variable, but everything else. And we chose the setting had to be large bulbous stills, triple distillation, tailsy cut. Essentially kind of like a trad pot reference point. But what would happen if you double distill this? What would happen if you like Springbank styled it? Any of these odd jumping off points. What would happen if you malted the wheat or whatever? Because we're using the core traditional raw, but you're in this brave new category. You're allowed to use both. So this is the beginning, but you'll never have as much wonder and excitement as you do at the start of a new category, for want of a better word, a revived category. You have the shadow of the past and to draw from that. But then similarly, like, again, we didn't max it out to 30% rye because it wasn't done in the past, but there's nothing stopping people now, and take this information and try and learn the ropes of this kind of like monkey bar setup of what does all this stuff do, and God knows what happens when you peat it, and there's all this space out there to play. But it was great to have the context, and it was great, and I think again the Coonies were very understanding of what I was trying to do, and I know I can be very adamant at times, so even like having it distilled twice so that we didn't have faints corruption going from one wash to the other, and then we were drawing off the samples from the second distillation, and just everything we could do to keep it as pure as possible and to keep the data. And I was amazed. I remember, so the partner, the thesis is through TU Dublin, the formerly known as DIT, and the partner project, or the partner for the forthcoming paper that's a part of the thesis, is Harriet Watt out in Edinburgh. And I remember going out and speaking to the guys out there, and they were amazed at the like an industry involvement at this scale, because most of these kinds of experiments are done on little setup prop kits, and to have a full scale and to have that, again, repetition and trying with enzymes and without enzymes and giving it that context was such a privilege. And I only had that reinforced to me by them, you know, being shocked by the willingness, you know, of a company to take time off to do this. So yeah, I mean, it's a hugely, you know, huge testament to the goodwill of my fellow man, and quite possibly misplaced faith in my own, you know, because again, like I would have felt a mix of like panic, you know, panic, anxiety, and embarrassment if all this stuff had ended up tasting grim, or you know, and then there's been this huge waste of time. But yeah, I mean, it was fun, and I think, or if something had broken, I suppose something had broken. If it was going to break, it would have been this one. The am I right? We're on number 5.
Well, we're on number 5 now, yeah. Well, I'd say the one thing that's coming through in spades in the comments section here, Fionnán, is why in the world you brought all those data to the pub and not to leave it there.
Can whoever is with Fionnán and the Duke of York take that data and put it somewhere safe? If I've learned anything from my last trip to Belfast and Fionnán's misplacing of items he should not misplace, do not misplace that data after all this work.
Well, we can all do it again some other time. Great.
As I was saying today, I think we used up every ounce of available spirit for this tasting kit. So let's please not do it again. But yeah, let's move on to our next distillate. So this is mash bill number 5. This is your formative cradle for Irish pot still. 30 oats, 30 malt, and 40 barley. So this is definitely, as you said, if something was going to break the louder tone, this is what it was.
Yeah, and I mean, this is, when I say formative cradle, this is the most consistent mash. If you're going to try and like describe, you know, if we define Irish pot still as a term for the history of mixed mash bills in Ireland, this evolving culinary behemoth, and how do we bind it together? And the thing that's, you know, this mash is like a specific mash in J.A. Nettleton, but it's also generally, and the further back you go, the more general mash bills become, you know, and one thing you often see is a kind of a third each way of malt, raw barley, and oats. But generally with very low malt, you know, 30% is kind, you know, usually it's close to like 25% or, you know, lower. But this third each way concept with raw barley spiked, you know, you find from, again, like even like Daniel O'Connell, odd people make reference to the manufacture of whiskey in the early 1800s, but they are talking, you know, and of course they're using general terms, and they say, you know, 1 part oats, 1 part barley, 1 part malt. But even in the Nettleton era, you know, what people forget, the malt tax was abolished for spirits in 1855, before Irish pot still took its great strides forward, or just as, you know, it was already irrelevant by then. And what you do see happen is malt content goes up, definitely, but it doesn't go all that high. It like calibrates to, you know, again, the like 25 to 50 space. And in Dublin, again, it hits its highest with like 40 to 50 kind of parameters. But it doesn't, you know, malt whiskey doesn't replace pot still. You know, there's so many things that don't happen. You wonder, you know, why? But there's certainly a floating reference to the use of about 30% malt in a lot of these. When it dips down to 10, there's suggestions of you know, inferior product. But they were happily making like 14% malt content stuff in when they were really under the thumb of the excise. But when they come out of that space, or you know, when they're under that duress, 30% malt is seen as like this mash is a kind of a premium mash, but it doesn't go away after the malt tax. This 30-40-30 thing cracks on. And there's a thesis written by a woman named Deirdre Priestley about the Powers family, and I remember flipping through it, and there's an interview with one of the guys there who talks about oats having an effect, like an enzyme effect, on distillates with low malt contents and compensate. Now, of course, now we can use enzymes artificially, but of course there's all these, you know, practical things that were there in the background at the same time, you know, but in the same sense that like malt makes alcohol, that's why we use it, full stop. You know, the only thing there that's not for a pragmatic effect seemingly is raw barley. And But anyway, when I remember seeing this, 30% oats, it always got to me, because we heard all the time, oh, it's only for filtration, a small 5%. And this was the drastic, for huge swathes of history, they're using a massive chunk. Now, was that related to another practical consideration or not? But all these things are correlated, really. No decision is made in a vacuum. But it is there for a very, very long time, this wallop of oats mash bill. And yeah, again, reasonably high raw barley, higher raw barley than malt. The other one had higher malt than raw barley by a margin of 20%. So still a good context. And also looking back to to mashes 2 and 3, we've gone from 5 to 15 to 30. So this is maxing out oats. And there's the question of A, will this break something? And B, what happens when you push oats to that, brim, as it were?
Well, what do you think happened, Fionnán?
Oh, it collapses. It gets much worse. My God, this is terrible. No, it's funny, and I know I said the other one smelled like tin pear, but this really smells like tin pear. The previous one has more like tin peach. The other one is like tin peach goo, whereas here we're getting the tin pear goo. There is that, but there's also that pithy. And I mean, Old Bow Street whiskey used to smell like, and that was not this mash bill, but Old Bow Street whiskey smells a lot like orange pith or orange peel or both, and that weird clementine smell in the pot still. And this definitely has that. This has that weird, you say citrus, but you want to make it clear this is not lemon and lime. This is orange and the orange family, whatever the name for that subfamily is of tangerine, clementine, and all their bits and anatomical parts, pith, peel, oil, that stuff. It's there in a big way. The cream is still there. In fact, now you're pushing out. It's almost like there wasn't a huge leap between the 5 and the 15 in terms of viscosity. But when you max it up to 30, you start getting, it starts smelling like cream. It starts smelling like actual, huff and cream. Not that anyone in this room huffs cream. What an absurd concept. It's that weird. It's so spry. It's so lively. The ginger is back on form, having come up. The raw barley is back up to 40, higher raw barley than malt again. So you're back into pot still space, but it is still just such fruity distillate. You have that pith, you have that peel, but you also have just that waxy clementine. Again, almost like the smell of waxed citrus. I hate how difficult it is to find unwaxed fruit in Ireland because it makes a shit cocktail if you try and make an old fashioned with one. But there is a very particular smell to citrus that's been waxed for transport. I don't want to dominate the whole thing, Michael.
Yeah, no, I think this is where you start to come back not to emphasize, but this is again back where your learnings, your barley's gone back, your barley's gone up by. That gap is there, the 10%. Your oats has gone up to 30%, so it's the intensification of the oats, and it's really turned back into that. It's like biting into the orange with the skin on. You have that zestiness, you have that orange, but if that could be a pleasant experience, biting into an orange with skin on, you have the zestiness and all that citrus character. It's full of spryness. It's sweet, but it's not at all the sweet that the previous high malt one was. It while being in the similar ballpark, it presents itself in a completely different light. It's so much more lively, so much more zest to it. And that's, I think, from reversing those roles of bringing the barley up and reducing down that malt character, but then it presents itself as that sweet sugar dusting zestiness that a tasting note I touched on earlier, that refresher kind of those refresher bars. You get the little yellow lemony for refresher bars. But yeah, no, this is a gorgeous drop, and one of the
lemon tinted, toilet sponge, that kind of, real.
We nearly broke the brew house for a toilet sponge.
But there is that weird, within that zest, there's almost like the other thing, and I know I put this in the notes before, was soda bread, which comes up in a lot of these. And it's a weird, and as the oats go up, it's another, you know, when you get past that like obvious frosting flavor, that's synthetic sweetness. There is this weird like McCambridge's bread kind of smell. And here, that weird like orange and soda bread, the like baking flour smell, which I fit in with the soda bread smell, that weird, again, like dustiness that's not the sweet dust, it's not the castor sugar, just like a pale dustiness. It almost tastes like, you know, again, like I remember you know, orange blossom water, and it gets used in a lot of like Mediterranean fruit. And I remember trying it on its own for the first time and being revolted because I expected it to taste like, you know, really sweet and whatever, and it tasted really soapy and strange. But it has this wonderful effect on food, and that strange like wax and orange flavor, you know. I think you were describing with the like if it was pleasant to bite into a citrus, but it still has that gingery bite. It as the raw barley's gone back up, we're getting back to that like ginger snap biscuits kind of taste. There's a weird like sourness when you taste. It's almost like I think the note I used before was Fanta. You know, the like Fanta orange flavor, the like strangely like sharper sensation of the ginger and the citrus kind of meeting each other. You know, but it's lovely. And again, a little bit more oil than the last one. It's a bit more. It's still kind of waxy rather than oily. It's not as, you know, like, again, musty, heavy as mash number one, but it's definitely back on kind of familiar ground with pot still. But then in this again, like just bursting at the pith oranginess. But no, I like it a lot. You know, I was quite well. I was delighted. I remember knocking this back because we had these logs, and Matt will remember them. I was meant to keep a log of what went on, and they're great to listen to. They're, you know, piss all use because nothing went wrong. So, you know, we don't have to catalog much. It was a huge success story. But I think, you know, Michael would pop in around, I don't know, 9 o'clock, 10, and, you know, take the edge off the day with an old log, you know, and we've probably discussed these spirits from every possible angle, and a huge archive of discussion about them. But I do remember the log after this, and mostly it was just a sense of relief. And it was, you know, just like not a piss up, but, you know, a session of celebration because nothing had gone wrong. I think this stuff was great, you know, Jesus. You know, so it was tinted with a puncturing of stress, I think, at the time. But even taste on its own, it's a lot of fun, you know. Yeah,
because I think as well, like it came in the middle. We knew once we got past this kind of this level of oats that we were kind of home and hose. Then at that stage, once you get over the 30%, none of the rest of the adjunct. Yeah, there's nothing like a good dose of new make spirit at 10 o'clock in the morning to give you a false sense of confidence as well. So we thought we could defeat the world at that stage, but I whatever about the toilet rocker, the toilet push notes. This was a very pleasant, considering how we were told it would turn out. This is a very pleasant little cherry on top. The fact that the brew house did its job, and then the distillations produced something to this quality is something that we can be extra happy with or extra pleased with.
Well, perhaps we should move from the most feared and perhaps one of the most interesting whiskeys into out of the realm of oats. So we are leaving away number 5. I see that Brendan Cardy has just joined us. I gave you a little slide there, but I'm not sure if you caught it. We were on number 5. And now we'll jump into mash number 6, which is our first inclusion of a second exogenous grain, which is wheat. So 15 wheat, 50 oats, 30 malt, and 40 barley. So mash number 6, which is our little kind of off pink label here. And I think even just looking at the bottles here as they go along, very, very aesthetically pleasing. I know the Cooney family put a lot of work into designing these to perhaps look half as good as I hope they taste. So, Fionnán, would you like to tell us the history of the history of wheat in Ireland with Mash Bill number 6.
Yeah, and it's a strange one because we use, again, they fill historical questions as much as they replicate historical mashes. So again, a lot of these overlap with each other. So if you take, we'll have one later on, it's essentially the same mash rounded in a different direction. But you do see, because again, they've all been decimalized into 5 to 10% increments and so forth. So some of them, if it's like at 12%, you go down and up. So looking at this one question, and we'll see another mash later that will again help fill that out. Is wheat in the early 1800s, when you read like Samuel Morwood, the second name I was dropping earlier after Nettleton. So Nettleton is later, Morwood is early excise. And he refers to something quite close to the mash we just drank. And then he says, some distillers prefer wheat to their oaten. Now the wheat could be extremely high. Like early on, you're talking like, again, it's almost like 30 to 50. The 51 is pretty fringe, but it collapses and it suddenly becomes like 15 and then 5, and it stays at kind of like 5 to 15 for the rest of its duration in Ireland, and eventually becomes 5 and then disappears off. And of course, there's always pragmatic reasons as well. People aren't just pulling these as romantic as I can be, along with the best of them. And I know Michael is saying you look back at these flavors, but of course there is historical context as well. And I always have to remind myself of that. And there is a very clear history of wheat in Ireland. It's largely bound up with the famine. And it's, after the famine, there was 8% of the wheat tillage there had been 10 years before. It collapsed as a crop. It becomes, it's pretty expensive. So they're always operating in these contexts. And similarly at the start, so you have in the 1780s, in 1784, something called Foster's Corn Laws that gets passed. And and not to be confused with the Corn Laws, which are the famous ones, which are a bit later. And corn in the original sense of grain of any kind, something with a kernel. So all these, when you see these references to corn, it's grain, full stop. But Foster's Corn Laws were essentially encouraging Ireland to grow wheat, because Britain, for the first time in its history, was a net grain importing island because of a rising population, essentially. And then you get increased expertise in certain forms of tillage and so forth, and parts of Ireland that were not that great for growing wheat get sown with wheat, and all this stuff happens. And then you get the Napoleonic Wars in the 1810s, and Napoleon puts an embargo on grain getting to Britain, essentially trying to starve Britain out of hostilities in the Peninsular War. And suddenly Ireland really gets sown with wheat. And then the Battle of Waterloo defeated Napoleon, the embargo drops, and the price of Irish wheat falls through the floor. But there's all this cheap wheat knocking about. And of course, the mashes from that time are thumpingly heavy with wheat. So there's this whole story. And then even, I remember going through records from the 1840s where, distillers are looking for applications from the government for what, we used to call the emergency World War II. Where wheat was rationed, and you see them, and that's the very tail end, and then it disappears. And it could well have been that exact thing that during the emergency becomes very difficult to get, and that's the final death knell of wheat. But we're tracking, every mash we've had so far has been the same concept: malt, raw barley, and oats in really detailed breakdowns. And now we're getting in wheat, where we're showing, how they change. But right now this is 15% oats and 15% wheat, so we still have oats in there, and that's there, but we've suddenly introduced a new character. And what's interesting about this one from like a data perspective is it is the same mash we had last, the 30 40 30, but instead of that it's 30 40 15 15. So again, the other two parameters haven't changed. We've just taken 15 off of oats and given it to wheat, essentially. But yeah, give it a smell. Wheat, I had great conversations with Alan Bishop out in the US, and anyone who's a bourbon fan, Alan is quite a name these days. The Spirits of the French Lick, and I was talking to him about wheat because I've had wheated bourbon many times. And of course, America's the only context we have for examining a lot of this stuff. And I'd always thought of wheated bourbon as like Pappy Van Winkle or Maker's Mark, these like very luxurious, creamy, softy. My personal taste, I prefer high rye bourbon to wheated bourbon. But it was so odd drinking some of this stuff. And one of the things he says, oh yeah, but that's all wheat coming off a column still. Now it's high content of retention column distillation, but still a column still. And he says, oh yeah, and in a pot still, what we find in the bourbon is you get a kind of a cream cheese smell off of wheat. And when I tried this, it made so much sense. That weird, like clotted cream kind of smell. It's a kind of a sweet cream, almost like, you know, I think got the poshest tasting notes I think I've ever written. Butter melting into crumpets. You know, but there is that weird, like sweet, and of course oats are still there, and they're giving their weird vanilla edge to it. But it was, for me, and it'll be more apparent when we have wheat without oats. But for me, the wheat has always been introducing this kind of like savory, bready, carbohydrate-y, you know, no surprise there. But also this, again, like cream cheese, clotted cream, these kinds of flavors. The sensation is, I'll put it this way, it'll take me ages to go through all that data. That's going to take months. But obviously, like after the panel's done, I did flip through it on the train here, just out of, you know, wild curiosity. And a lot of it hasn't been decoded because it was all, you know, randomized in terms of who was drinking what at what time. So it's not just people got things because they tried one thing after the other. But one thing that stood out very, very quickly is people seem to find texture, mouthfeel going up as you increase one of two things: raw barley, no surprise, and wheat. And wheat very consistently, it was, you know, going up, getting the distillate got fattier as wheat went up, and it became less sweet. Now here we have 15% oats, so you have that like sorbet effect that it had on the last one, but it's also in competition with that wheat. And again, like the closest I get is like banana cream pie, that like banoffee kind of taste, you know, that weird like pie crust. And then the cream is like cream cheese, like Philadelphia kind of smell. Also like clotted cream, and again that weird like you know, there's a drugginess about bread. Bread is so, you know, the late great food writer James Beard has a quote where he says, you know, there's no smell in all world food like the smell of baking bread. You know, it's not a food smell anymore. It's a primal thing. It's an addictive smell, and some of these wheaty ones, they have that weird like warm carbohydrates smell. You know.
Warm carbohydrates. Well, to jump in, Michael, this is the first time we're seeing wheat come into the mash bills here. I suppose from a production distilling perspective, was there any difficulties or anything that came up in terms of milling and mashing and distilling wheat in this quantity?
Not to the same context as to how much stress your oats would. Maybe it doesn't have the same levels of beta glucan, and of course you might distill you might brew your wheat slightly differently. But as I touched on a few different times now, the given the context of the project, we had to create a uniform brew method. So no, you had beta glucan breakdown, which is more probably more for the oats than the wheat, and it milled quite easily. We've a fairly high tech mill, and it brewed and yielded, relatively speaking, it yielded quite well as well. So no, there wasn't it didn't give us as much level of stress as the wheat did.
Whereas the oats did.
Or sorry, the oats did, I should say, yeah.
Well, I'd be very interested in people who are at home tasting this along with us to let us know in the comments section. I see a number of people dropping in comments, and I'm glad, Fionnán, that you were able to touch on the difference between column distilled and pot distilled wheat as well. It was actually, I opened my mouth to ask you the question, and you started talking about it already. It was like you're a mind reader. So, or we've clearly had way too
many talents.
Yeah. So in your estimate, Fionnán, I suppose, what kind of, you know, we're talking about the history of wheat in Ireland. This is one of the two kind of mash bills maybe that we don't have a date on it. Do you have kind of a general era of when this mash bill would have been?
Yeah, the turn of the 1900s. You know, we're talking like 1900s, 1910s. And again, you know, where there'll be a reference later on to Bandon. There's one marked Bandon, and that's largely because nobody, to my knowledge, has the trademark on Boann, and we're not pissing because it's difficult because of course all this stuff, these people still exist in some cases, but the Boann mash could just as easily be called the Tullamore mash. There's a lot of overlap, and if you take some of these practices and you look at one or the other, you're again just decimalizing in different directions. So if something says 12% wheat, you go up and down to 10 and 15, and so they've all got hard reference points, but they're similarly like they're investigation. They're chosen to investigate principles, but yeah, they all have at least one like hard origin, and this would be 1910s. But again, you were looking at that collapse of wheat in principle, which is why it, instead of another mash from 1910, was picked for selection. But they have that weird and it's funny again, long to be decoded, but I know they came up in some places, and I purposely didn't read into them before doing this because then I'm just reading off of everybody else's answers, and I really wanted to Michael and I had and yourself, Matt, had so many chats about this stuff. I think it's more sincere to have those talks instead of just reading off someone else's answers. But bell peppers came up an awful lot for the smell of this, and it's funny because I'd always focused on the carbohydrate, but there is this weird savoriness to a lot of the wheaters, and some of the panelists said that to me, oh, I didn't expect such and such to be, and so savory, and when I went back and looked at whatever the hell they were given at a time, but for instance, to give you an idea, now that we have some reference, one of the sets, if anyone who's on those panels is watching, we gave out was, the 30% oat one we just drank, this one, a control, and then 30% wheat, and test along that scale where everything, the other two grains are constant, the malt and the raw barley haven't changed, and it's just 30, 15, 15, 30, and then again back to the control. So trying wheat within it'll make more sense when we get on to the 30% wheat, but 15 and 15, it just seems to be a savory note injected, but with the sweetness still, there's still quite a lot. There's 3 times as much oats in there as there was in the Stardust, Pixie Dust one at the beginning. I think the nickname I gave this one was Whiskey on Scones. There is that instead of the later one will be dense cream, cooking cream, savory stuff. Whereas here, it's still a bit sweet. You still get that clotted cream flavor, that clotted cream on scones. You get that Philadelphia cream cheese. It's savory, but there's a little bit of something, vanilla-ish about it.
Well, perhaps I'm going to gloss over the fact that you said scones instead of scones. But
yeah, I said scones, and then I said scones because I'm up here. Because I said a fantastic map, a heatwave map of pronunciation of scone versus scone, and the heartland scone density is Scotland, and it radiates down into Ulster and northern England, and then the rest of Ireland is scone. Very consistently, London is scone, but it's a Google scone heatwave map or scone heat, and so I'm as a gesture of goodwill to my hosting city, I switched from scone to scone. I
think Brendan's thanking you in the comments there for you've changed your vernacular to Ulster English now. But perhaps this is a good point to take our leave of Mash Bill 6 and put it firmly in the completed pile, and now move into Mash Bill number 7, which is our 30% wheat. I am going to excuse myself for 1 second. I have a little bit of a sick dog here, so I'm going to go let her out. But Fionnán, if you want to give us a look into the wheat boom of the early 1800s, I'll rejoin you in one moment.
Grand. Okay, so we'll crack on. Did you have any thoughts on the last one just before we change? Because I know you didn't really get an opportunity to talk because I was shiking on about scone.
So much has changed. No, I think this was one of the most, because it's one of the more interesting mash bills because it's one of the more balanced in that it's not quite 30, but you have a sizable chunk of oats, you have a sizable chunk of wheat. You have a sizable chunk of malt and a sizable chunk of barley. Nothing is too far that it's dominant, and nothing gets to get dominant. But you do certainly start to see that pastry, that crust, that pie crust that you're talking about coming through, and still a subtle bit of that sweetness coming through from the oats. But the wheat, even at 50%, 15%, and even when there's enough of the other character, it is undeniably there as a savory, bready carbohydrate, like you said, style or tasting note on it. But no, number 7 is probably a more clearer example, or as clear an example as we're going to get, is it's 30%. It's 30% wheat. The question I wanted to ask, is there any suggestion? Joe, you were saying earlier that there was 14% malt, nothing to do with anything, but is there 14% malt? How genuine a figure do you think that is? Like, it was around the time the malt taxes, and would they be presenting that they're using 10 to 14% malt?
Well, that tends to come from independent observers. So yeah, absolutely. Like this, Morwood talks about how low it could get and how high it could get, and you do get the sense. I mean, the other myth we've been landed with was that like pot still was that we made malt whiskey in Ireland, and then the malt tax came and we made pot still to in this like Bugs Bunny outsmarting Elmer Fudd, and that's not really what happened at all. But what the malt tax did do was it like put the thumb down hard on the possibility of making malt as a living. But there had been like the first records of distilling grain in Ireland are all, look at like the Irishton markets in Kilkenny, and they're all about wheat. Now, usually because the government was always annoyed when people were distilling wheat because it was meant to be food. But there's a mixed grain history right from the get-go. And raw barley even, comes in, and again, like oats are older than raw barley in Irish distilling, as oat malt. But even raw barley itself is found a record from, almost a century before the malt tax was even extended to Ireland about the use of raw barley, and how you had essentially the Malters Guild trying to coerce the government into passing a tax on raw barley in Ireland to get Irish distilleries to make malt. And you think, like, had history gone this way, what would we have ended up with? And this is before anyone's even floated the idea of the malt tax. So it's all there in the background. What was the original?
But like, is that a genuine question?
When the malt tax was in force, so say like 1785 to 1855, malt can be extremely low, and it's for very practical reasons. Clearly, and when the malt tax is done, and at the time you saw people saying, well, like prestige whiskey should really be like closer to 25% and above, and when it recalibrates, you do get things balancing to about, say, like 25 to 50% malt content. They don't really go north of that, but certainly when we're looking at early stuff, yeah, it could be extremely low, and none of those have been picked, obviously. But of course, in many ways, grain whiskey, when it comes on tap in the column stills, replaces that space in the market where they have very low malt contents as well. But pot still became a different product. It became a prestige product by contrast to the column still. So this idea of like dodgily made pot still, fades into the background. In fact, actually, one of the best defenses in the What is Whiskey trial for the maintenance of grain whiskey, William Ross, the head of DCL, the ancestor company Diageo, and the vocal powerhouse behind the column still side of that debate. He says, if you get rid of us, you're just going back to shit pot still whiskey. There'll always be somebody making grim stuff, whereas our whiskey is just relatively neutral, and theirs was actively toxic. And which would you prefer? Industrialized, clean grain whiskey, or like the dodgy pot still distillers of yore? And he was dead right, and it's probably the argument that won him the case at the end of the day. That there'll always be cheap something, but our stuff is safe. And so again, when you're looking, there's always the context of like, you have to look, the past was full of charlatans as well. There's loads of people gaming the system in all kinds of ways, and they're part of the history as well. But, we can get dewy-eyed about some of them, but there's always a context, and it always, even among those who aren't dodgy producers, this sense of like having to pay a bloody malt tax, really does affect what you're capable of doing in your distillery. Absolutely.
Sorry, we went down a rabbit hole, Matt. We're still just about to start in number 7.
Well, that's good. I feel like thankfully I haven't missed too much, even though I'm sure I've missed an entire month of history lessons in college if I was to pay for it. But so Fionnán, we're looking at now 40 barley, 30 malt, and 30 wheat. So perhaps you've waxed lyrical enough for a moment, and I'll ask Michael then the return. When it came to removing the oats and distilling just wheat in this quantity, did you have any issues with processing the wheat, or perhaps with the malt content being quite low as well? It makes for a very interesting mash bill.
Yeah, with the wheat, and to counteract what Fionnán said, about people using oat as a brewing aid, or trying to the wheat. This was actually our highest yielding. This was actually our highest yielding of our mash bills, even in spite of the fact that it had 30% malt. Good runoff times, no issues, nothing no complaints at all. We didn't envisage there be as many issues with the wheat, and that proved to be the case. A great yield, and then a very interesting distillate off the back end. Like it's very savory, it's very bready, something maybe that we probably envisaged we might get some of the oats. I thought we were going to get viscosity and maybe grain character from the oats, and we ended up getting viscosity and density and maybe not quite grain character, but like breads, the various types of bread character or pastry character coming through in bucket loads from the wheat.
I like that Fionnán looks like he's about to sing some kind of old Shankill into the glass there now.
Like you still have like this now. You still have you have that spryness. You have that spryness by keeping that barley, like we spoke, that trend of keeping the barley 10% higher than the malt. But yeah, the character, that mix of creaminess and dairy like density coming through, and that breaded character is there in bucket loads from the wheat. It's certainly an interesting characteristic. I'm not sure if it's my favorite of influences of the adjuncts, but it's a very clear cut influence that it's had on the distillate.
And do you think that if you were going to go back and do it again, is that 10% of barley above the malt something that you'd want to retain as a distilling practice yourself?
Yeah, look, everyone has their own personal preferences as far as what characteristics are concerned. Like if you like that gummy like sweetness that we spoke about, like the kind of almost like fruit pastel kind of like levels of sweetness, you start to increase the malt. But if you want something more spry and more oily and yeah, like it's that my ideal mash bill, if I was to pick an ideal mash bill, would have a difference of 10% of keep the barley higher than the malt by 10%, add in at least maybe 10% of oats. I don't think you need to go higher, less than 10%. I don't think you need to go higher than the 10% of oats, and that will turn that oily, that spryness into that citrus sugar dusting, and then an adjunct that we haven't yet to taste that just add in a little bit of oats to that pepper cracker of an effect. But equally, like I now know that depending on the characteristics that somebody's trying to achieve, that if I want to create that sweet flavor profile or more like a tinned fruit sweetness, I increase the malt and reduce the barley content. If I want to increase a breaded note or that pastry kind of note, and a little bit of creaminess and density, increase the wheat, and decrease the raw or the barley and the oats. It's a working relationship, but it's all based on what each individual would be more. But I suppose I have my idea of what I would picture in my head as the classical pot still style has that at least that buffer of 10% between the barley and then I suppose of the adjuncts that introduces the flavor profile to build upon that. That texture, the flavor profile that I found most appealing was that sugar dusting, that citrus that you got from adding in the oats. Oh yeah, but that's not to dismiss the wheat that we're currently tasting either.
Yeah, Fionnán, do you want to give us a little deep dive into the nose here as you sing some lovely old ballads to a glass? Or?
And the old triangle. How you like me now, Belfast? I said scone. I did my bit. No, I'll spare you the ballads. What was I going to say? The smell for me, it's a weird, again, like one thing that seems to have in early days been tagged with the data is that people regard wheat categorically as less sweet than oats, and when we were imagining this stuff, again, when we thought of oats, that was like really beefy and blah, blah, blah. But no, it was wheat that turned out to be the one. And of course, like, you look at wheat of bourbon, it still does have a weird savory thing. It's like a kind of like a creamy, but not, they say creamy, but they don't know what cream is in Kentucky. What they mean is not rye, is the term they're looking for. But oats genuinely had that like creamy vanilla high note, again, like almost glycerin, really sweet, like almost like aspartame, these artificial sweetener kind of smells, wedding cake, that kind of stuff. And that was really a sideliner. And I've seen that come out, again, when we're doing the documentary with the Cumber on the other side, and the same thing was happening, and we're learning as we go along, what this stuff does, and people are just putting their toes in the water. But then wheat was very clearly coded to smells of like savoriness and people's perceptions of heaviness. And it's not the same like oiliness that we're used to, the same like pot still oil is a very easy trait to track. But it's almost like somebody's dropped butter in the glass. It's a weird like fattiness, like a different kind of oily sensation. It's a kind of, again, like, there's, unlike the other one that had 15% oats and 15% wheat together, and you have that like clotted cream kind of smell, the sweeter side of cream. This smells like dense cream. My mother and her sisters just drink cream like fish drink water. Well, I don't think fish do drink water. I think they breathe water. Still don't quite understand the. Do
you breathe whiskey, Fionnán?
Well, I've whiskey gills. Just under here, I kind of keep them discreet. I remember them bringing home like dense, like double cream. And double cream, if anyone's ever drunk double cream, it's not like whipped cream. It's not sweet cream. It's like butter in a more liquidy form. It's really dense and it's really savory. And for me, this smells like double cream. It smells, it's lost, even the sweetness of the 15% oats, 15% wheat one had, and it's become very, very savory. Very, very buttery. The texture is very, very buttery. And of course, you've got the oil in there as well from high raw barley content. So between the two of them, the 40% raw barley and the 30% like buttery, savory wheat, it is a stone cold savory dram. And you wonder, like, what will this do? And we're finally starting to learn, because again, like you take like a classic era 1960s Irish pot, and they tend to have about 5% wheat in them. The ones we'd be familiar with from like cracking open old bottles. That's not much, but I can't believe it's not butter. Yeah, absolutely. But it does have that weird. Like it's not the milk lippity thing from the oats, and it's not pot still oil. It's almost like a glue type sensation. And again, a lot like butter is a kind of a sticky. It's not like crackly, like lick the back of a stamp stickiness. It's like some sort of fatty lipid that like won't leave your tongue kind of sensation. And I mean, butter, like I love butter. Jesus, I mean, I remember, my God, this like hero of a young child in Super Value. I think I told one of you this story before, but she threw a fit in the aisle with, I don't know if you've seen that golden olive stuff, the like fakey butter that's good for your health. And this kid was throwing it on the ground going, "It's no good for toast." And the child is going to lead millions. She step aside, Greta. Now we have vision. Now we have, the voice of tomorrow. But that stuff is rubbish. But when you try like real butter, and of course like Irish people when they go abroad, infamously complain about other people's butter, because our butter is so good, and I think we're spoiled on it. But there's also that weird taste for butter, in Ireland. That again, like layering. Was it? I think Michael said it reminded him of scooping butter off digestive biscuits. Was the term? I'll let Michael tell that story.
Well, no. Well, if you've seen what I'm using to try and keep myself sober, it's latherings of butter on I don't know whether to drink from the glass or just eat from the plate beside me here. It's more or less the same.
Maybe top the toast with some
yeah, that's a food pairing for you, like latherings of butter. I think it was more for the previous where you still had that like kind of rich, I don't know, that rich tea or that digestive biscuit kind of like maybe a crackling of sweetness, but the breaded character, the pastry character of the wheat was still a dominant force, but there was a layering on of almost like butter, and that's showing my West Kerry rearing there, that it was like a treat was to scoop butter with a rich tea biscuits. That's my tasting note, not scones or whatever tasting notes you had. Your felt tip pens and your toilet brush. I had
a fancy toilet sponge. But it still has that weird, like, again, it is butter, but it's also, as you said, like bread. Like there's a weird like day old pan, I think was another note I had used, that kind of like, and I think it was you that came up with baguette crust. Never mind my bloody scones. The crust of the baguette, Monsieur Walsh himself. But there is that weird, like out of the oven carbohydrate smell, but similarly like day old smell. I think the nickname I gave this was day old shortbread, still grand. There is that weird, like slightly stale, crusty is a better term than slightly stale, carbohydrate smell off them.
Stale shortbread, still gorgeous.
Still gorgeous. Oh geez, you know what? Yeah, because when you like pick up like a piece of shortbread, and I hope I'm not alone here, and you're like, that's a little bit coarse looking. I don't know how long that's been there, and you eat it, and like it's still essentially like really buttery. It's still gorgeous, regardless of what the fucking expiry date said. But anyway, when I'm not smelling, toilet sponge,
it's stale shortbread
on stale shortbread. But there is a sweet, and I went looking for sweetness on purpose, and the only sweetness I can get off these is like Werther's Original. That kind of like even like wheaty smelling. I still don't understand what's in Werther's Original. Is it caramel? But any of that weird like caramel, hard caramel smell is as close as. But it's really it is just incredibly savory stuff, and it's good to know and to learn that, because again, even in Ireland, like our context for wheat, and we don't even make that much grain whiskey with wheat. Middleton grain in the 80s was made with wheat, in a weird like blip between starting with maize and then turning back to maize. Obviously, most Scottish grain whiskey is made with wheat, not all, but similarly, like when we're looking at wheat in Ireland, it's highly refined through columns. So it's not the same thing. And again, like even refinement aside, I'm always taken back to Alan out in America, because I always have to go to these American touchdowns. And I took a trip out to Kentucky to talk to these guys, Pat Heist and all these like brilliant people doing innovative and strange stuff in bourbon, but they're the only people who understand wheat, because we've lost all of this stuff, and they understand the context of like what happens with wheat and maize together. in a wheated bourbon context, and we're trying to apply that backwards to like, what does wheat do with raw barley, let alone what does wheat do with oats, another grain that we've lost, and trying to recuperate some of this logic. So yeah, the project isn't just a kind of like masterpiece theater, Jane Austen meets pot still revival. We are trying to get the ropes back, and that was another reason I was so glad to have so many distillers in the room and trying these grains, especially when you try the 30% oats and the 30% wheat, and we had 15-15 in the middle, and you could start to see this dramatic logic of how things change. And who would have thunk it, that oats would be the sweetie pie and wheats would be, well, again, like when I was a guy just mentioned, Pat Heist, who's a yeast chemist and distiller out in Kentucky and does brilliant stuff. My Facebook, and I'm sure on this kind of a group, I can't be the only one who's bombasted with ads for MGP, Midwest grain products, and they have a round table of distillers. And Pat Heist, the guy with the kind of Fu Manchu beard. Anyway, I remember he also has a distillery called Wilderness Trail, and he was using malted wheat. And it had this really like yeasty kind of flavor to it. And again, there were wheat for me is always, within bourbon, it's always seen as in contrast to, do you put wheat in bourbon or do you put rye in bourbon along with your maize? And the rye bourbon, and especially the high rye bourbon, is very cinnamony and so forth, and the wheat bourbon is very mellow. But even within the Maker's Marks of the world, even within the Pappy, I've always found wheat had a very like glutinous. Now there's no actual gluten; it's distilled out. But as you know, actually, Matt, well, you're not a celiac, but a possible celiac, a man I thought for you.
I'm allergic to wheat, funnily enough, but the liquid in the glass is fine.
Yeah. So again, well, it all seems to be distilled out anyway. But there's still that weird, like, snuffy sensation from smelling anything distilled with wheat, and I think this is no different. You have that weird, again, and that mixed with pot still oil just ends up smelling like butter. Greasy butter in the pan, dissolving butter, kind of smell. That oil and butter liminal space.
Well, one of the things I was very impressed by throughout the entire process was the kind of systematic increases, decreases to fit the gaps in the mash bill recipes, and I think probably gives us a great place to start mash bill number 8 if you're happy with that. To look at now reducing the wheat down to 5% and then bringing back in 15% oats. And I know it's fantastic that you were able to pick such a wide range of mash bills that also kind of fit to the data points we wanted to explore as well. If you bring one up or you bring one down, what are the impacts, I suppose, that they bring to the party? Now there's mash bill number 8. Nice kind of bronze paper color, and this is your Irish Pot Still Distillers Association definition from 1953, which would have been the remaining pot still distilleries at that point. So we had Locks, Jameson, Powers, Cork Distilleries Company,
B. Daly,
and at one point Bushmills was in it. I think until they realized they didn't make pot still, so there was no reason to be in it.
Yeah, and Cumber wasn't in it either. So there is a weird politics thing that happens, unfortunately. Thank you very much. Now, thankfully, Cumber's mashes are fantastically well preserved in McGregor's office up this way. And again, a big discovery that the stuff was so available and nobody had ever seen it. And I remember getting Graham Miller from Ecklenville a Prony membership, and like saying, "No, Graham, it's really, really easy. Here, sign this form. Done. Now we can go upstairs. It's going to take them 2 minutes to print out your little card, and now you can get in whenever you like." But at the same time, they had lost the stuff and didn't know that they had it. But anyway, that becomes its own orbital. And it's funny, I did go looking for Bushmills stuff, which strikes people as very surprising because, on the thesis about mash bills, Bushmills single malt. But actually, when Bushmills ran columns out in Coleraine when they produced their own grain whiskey in house. They were making a barley-based grain whiskey product out from Coleraine, and that's a mash bill in itself. They were essentially using malt and raw barley to make grain whiskey and then bringing it in as something that still survives in Blackbush, in that weird product that Middleton supplied to them, the bar, the GPL, and so there was that there. But yeah, when you see that IPDA, there's definitely the last cohort of the like southern pot still purists, and how and there was the 1951 Act, and they're writing letters to revise it and explain what's missing. And then there is a very clear definition of Irish pot still, and it's a fantastically written paragraph. It's just like, the distillers of Ireland, comma, who thrived in the Middle Ages before government supervision, comma, have this to say, about the manufacture of our whiskey. There's a real dig in. But anyway, yeah, they defined it as 40% malt, 40% raw barley, 15% oats, and 5% wheat, which is really the core spine. If we're to talk about like old gen pot still, Bow Street, etc., we the stuff people who have had is like Redbreast from the 60s. Because of course, 1953, if you lay stock down in 1954, let alone in 7 years, in 12 years, early 1960s, that's what that is. So that was the logic I always had to use, was like forecast from when the spirit is laid down. 1967 is the, IDL converted it all into blends in 1968. So, pot only goes to 1967. And if you're tracking, now Cork distillers seem to have been just using filtration oats. Cumber have their own thing, but they're not even included. But there is a homogenization around Dublin practice, and not just Dublin, Lochs and Tullamore. But the canal side distilleries really were a branch of Dublin. They were making Dublin whiskey elsewhere. They were always part of that shared sphere, probably because of the canals, and they saw themselves in a similar peer group. But it does solidify to something close to like 40-40, 15-5. And if you're to come to grips with a lot of the old bottlings that we would know, that aren't Cork distillers, that aren't Cumber, which again, just pure oats, Cork using less oats, Cumber using more oats. This when we're talking about the old Dublin style, would be the thing. Originally it had like 1% rye, a tiny smattering of rye that we'll talk about later, but that seems to have disappeared. And then you're just getting that spread. But it's a great touchstone, because it is, this is what pot still was. If I'm to nail all this stuff down to like hard 20th century lost mash bill of Ireland, it's this one, And I was really, really excited to try it. And it was also exciting to find as a document, because it showed me how recent the bloody history was. This isn't ancient history. This is stuff that people crack open all the time, and that's what that was, and how do we grapple with the logic of old Gilby's Redbreast? How do we grapple with the logic of Bow Street? How do we grapple with the logic? Now, Tullamore did keep a tiny bit of Ryan till the day they closed, but the same principle. But when they have to put it to the government, they have to explain, this is what Irish pot still whiskey is. The answer they come up with is 40% malt, 40% raw barley, 15% oats, and 5% wheat. And so to see them lay that down, they all sign it. It's postmarked from Bow Street. It was a huge document to discover. And it was just from, it was in the, and I can pass around the filing number. It's in the National Library of Ireland, which is now open after being closed for a year for COVID. And it's in the Lochs archives, but there's one folder in the Lochs archives that's Lochs copies of the IPDA notes, just their copies that were sent around to them after every meeting. And so, yeah, it was a huge part of the process of the thesis. And you get a bit of everything. That's it. You get that, like, I think it's a vanilla wafer is the... you have
a bit of digestive biscuits and butter, is there?
Yeah. You get almost like... if you ever get, like, the vanilla... where scones, even posh, the vanilla Milano biscuits, like the Milano biscuits, but the white entrance instead of the like whatever it is, chocolate Nutella, the dark ones. But that weird like note over the butter, you're just at that sweet spot of like oaten. What we now know, and what I think everyone doing this tasting now understands, is that oaten vanilla and wedding cake flavor over just enough savoriness, and you're getting that wafer kind of smell, and then you get the green apples from the raw barley, that crackly green apple, Granny Smith. You get a little bit of fruit from them all. But again, like pot still was never fruity in the sense that, but there's another, and again, the oats was a big discovery. The fact that oats had not been a meatier angle of pot still, they'd been a grace note, they'd been a sweeter side of pot still, and that they work so well with that oil. It's a different kind of sweetness. It's sugar sweetness. It's baker's sweetness rather than orchard sweetness, if that makes sense. But they're we've come to the point with this that I think the viewers can get a sense of that logic and work it out for themselves, how this all fits together, how you get that slight bit of breadiness from what's now 5% oats, how you have that, again, like frosting, wedding cake frosting from the 15% oats. I think in the official notes I put out, it said buttermilk, but there is that weird like sour buttermilk. I went through a weird, COVID was a long, dark period for a lot of people. And at one point, I was reading texts from the late Middle Ages and the early modern period in Ireland about Irish food. And I was getting really into this stuff. And I spent about 3 weeks eating a monastic diet. And I only ate like oaten cakes and this kind of stuff. And I made, various like leek soups for myself and living alone in the dead of winter in COVID. And, stuff gets into your head. But anyway, I was like, I can only understand the context of this if I live like this for long enough. Kind of cream of leek soup, but and there's a fantastic chef in Ireland, a guy named JP McMahon. I'm sure a lot of people know. He runs a restaurant out in Galway called Aneer, but he runs beyond his own restaurant. He runs a festival called Food on the Edge, and it's one of the more experimental kind of food symposiums in Ireland. And he's good friends with my thesis advisor, who is a food historian. And anyway, I on the basis of that, I was at some event and I bought McMahon's book, and it had loads of stuff because I bought it. I'm a terrible cook, but it had that kind of historical angle in Irish food, and I was buying it and looking to try and get at these like old monastic soups. And one thing, I found was like, and there's a very important article about the history of food in Ireland called Irish Food Before the Potato. It's written by a guy named A.T. Lucas, and he basically said the potato leveled the like old Gaelic or more properly Normano-Gaelic cuisine. The Normans had brought in cinnamon and spice and nutmeg and all these various things and cloves. And a lot of stuff that rocks up in the Red Book of Ossory, it's all Norman introductions, and they melded with the Gaelic cuisine that had been there. And there's quite a diverse scene. But one thing that class of people, old aristocracy, seemed to really loved was buttermilk. They drank a lot of dairy in general, but they enjoyed sour dairy. And I did spend like a month just drinking, and buttermilk is grim enough stuff to drink in retrospect, all the time. There's even that song, Whiskey on a Sunday, drinking buttermilk all the week and it's whiskey on a Sunday. Well, anyway,
Fionnán,
that was in my head.
Where was this going in relation to this whiskey?
Well, I'll put it this way. This is the first time I'll admit this. That habit only broke when I started going to Boann because, Paddy would lay out the sandwiches at lunch, so I could no longer keep the monastic diet. And I wasn't going to say, like, can't eat those. It interferes with my monastic diet. But anyway, I still had the taste of buttermilk really heavily in my mouth. And when I tried this one for the first time, there is that, like, strange, like, sour milk taste, along with the green apples, along with the wedding cake, along with the 5% wheat. Do you smell it? Have you had much buttermilk recently?
I know my days of monastic diet are over for me, Fionnán.
But there's that.
No, I can see where you're going with it, definitely.
That like it's not the like full dense cooking cream of the others. There's only that little 5%, and with that 15% oats, you're getting the vanilla and so forth. And what happens? You get this like slightly sour, slightly sweet, so sickly sweet kind of milk smell off of it, and it smells the spit of buttermilk, and when you taste it, again, it has this like gummy mouthfeel. I think is the best way of putting it. It's not adhesive, and it's not quite oily. It's not quite buttery. It's like gummy. This weird. It is thick. You can feel it. It's clearly not malt whiskey. It's got a good raw barley oomph behind it. But between that, like just a little bit of butter and again, the lipidness of the oats and whatever the hell is going on, and the green apple kind of taste, which is very, very much there. In fact, my nickname for this one was butter on green apples. You know, it does have that kind of gummyish mouth. You know, it's so, we're in a new textural language. It was so easy with Irish whiskey when we could have, you know, malt that we understood, and pot still was oilier than malt. You could always tell pot still from malt because it was just much thicker. But then when you're introducing these adjuncts and mucking about with the raw barley content in a space that's wider than just 50-50 to 60-40, you know, there's so much there, and there's so much to uncover and to grapple with, and to see what people will work with, you know. And again, a lot of the old gen pot stills used to have, as I said, like a weird American jello thing, not dissimilar to gummy, that like weird, like salinous jello that you've eaten and it dissolves into your mouth, you know, the kind of crumbly thing. I always wondered what the hell that was. But this was their mash bill for in most cases, not Cumber, not Cork distillers. And again, like Tullamore kept a little bit of rye at the end for until they closed, or until they sold the brand to Powers. But when it came time to, you know, pen a document to the Dáil, this was the decision made, was this mash bill, you know. And if anyone, and I've been raring to say this for ages, and now I'm finally at liberty to say, if you go to an old bottle tasting, you're cracking into old pot still bottlings, 9 times out of 10, this is essentially what you're drinking, you know, was this thing here.
And they petitioned the Dáil, and as this definition was never entered into legislation, I imagine it fell on deaf ears.
Yeah, they didn't care. They're like, why are you telling us about the specifics of your product? What does this have to do with legal regulation? We don't care. Which is a fair point. You know, like, this is not to do with our relationship with you. You know, we don't care about the, you know, gastro specifics of your mash bill. We care about, like, you know, making sure that product made in France can't be sold as Irish whiskey, and that's about as far as we'll go. You know, the relationship between the IPDA and the Dáil was quite hostile for a long time. And I mean, again, opening the letter with like the distillers of Ireland who thrived in the Middle Ages without government intervention, you know, they didn't get along. And the Dáil at that time, of course, you're talking about like late years of the Free State, early years of the Republic, high level of protectionism in terms of, you know, they capped exports, all this stuff. There was a lot of heavy taxes. There was a lot for them to not agree about. So, you know, it's not surprising that they weren't listened to.
That's very fair. Well, perhaps it's time to introduce our third adjunct in one of, I suppose we have 2 mash bills left, but now we're looking at mash bill number 9.
I'm just doing Jack's very, very quickly.
That's all right. But the mash bill number 9, for anyone that is still tasting along with us, this is a really interesting mash bill for me because this we're looking at 40 barley, 30 malt. So we're similar to the last mash bill, not quite the same, but then we move into 15 oats, 10 wheat, and 5 rye. So we've certainly entered into a very new area here. And as Fionnán mentioned, rye in Irish whiskey, in the history of Irish whiskey, has never been that quite plentiful in any of the records he's been able to find. Michael, the first mash bill now with all 3 adjunct grains in it. I'm just going to keep this up here just for people to see. What was this like in terms of production for you? Because obviously now rye is a new grain coming in. It's you know, you're milling, you're mashing. What was it like for you?
Yeah, the most difficult part from a production point of view is, again, look, once we had got to this stage, once we started getting to number 9, we had to pre our first brew, we had to predetermine our brew method, and so by this stage we were fairly confident in our brew method, even though there's a high proportion of adjuncts and a low proportion of malt. The biggest difficulty or the biggest challenge this brew presented was the number of grains that had to go through a mill. So even just, they're all different sizes, they're all different shapes. Having to change your mill parameters to just be able to deal with that. But bar that, they didn't present too much of a challenge. But that's not to underplay it. Milling is not to be dismissed for its level of importance. If you mill too fine, what happens is you end up with not enough husk left in, or not enough of the outer shells of the grains left to create a structure within the brew or the lauter. So you put in your grains, you put in your liquid, and then you want your liquid to filter down through the grains. If you don't have enough of that structural wall of the husk still remaining, then what ends up happening is it like sand, it compacts, and then your liquid won't pass through. And adversely then, on the other end, if you mill too coarsely, you won't actually break up your grains. Grains enough, and so you won't be able to get access to all of that endosperm or all of the internal structure of the grain, and so you won't get your extract. So there's that balancing act was probably the biggest difficulty or the biggest challenge with a mash bill like this, is actually trying to stop and then rearrange the mill and then go again and mill rye and then wheat and then oats and then malts and then barley, obviously, and each of them have their own level of their own sizes, their own shapes, and their own actual physical hardness of the grain. So, but thankfully, this again I should have here. This again was on the this was on actually on the lower yielding side of things, but that's not probably to be surprised or too much of a surprise. It's only on the 30% malt, but not a disastrous yield either in relative terms.
Oh, fantastic. I mean, it's exciting to be able to now experience, as Fionnán and I have been saying as we've gone through, hopefully those imbibing along with us have been able to identify different flavor aspects of what's added or taken away as we increase or decrease certain grains. And the thing I'll say about rye is that even in small quantities, it does have quite a large flavor contribution. So I hope this one is enjoyed. Fionnán, Bandon Distillery mash bill, 1910s.
Grand. Do you want to try? I'm conscious there's a poor man who's been doing all the tech in front of me. And
all right. Well, I'll say in the background, just while you get yourself sorted there, Fionnán. Again, these are all 63% ABV, and people have been joining us now for almost 3 hours, and we appreciate that this is quite a long tasting, but a lot of spirit to go through. So I hope you are enjoying. If you're imbibing, I hope you're very much enjoying. So we're on the penultimate of the mash bill, but please, Fionnán, fire ahead.
Grand. Well, Bandon, again, it's one of a range that had the same mash bill. So the Boann mash bill is an allusion to the West Cork Heritage Museum, which it wasn't actually me, it was Charlie Roach. And I don't think he's on this, so I can say that the thesis is actually dedicated to Charlie and one other person. But a wonderful friend of the thesis as well as myself. But we picked Boann for this one because it's not owned by anyone. You know, this mash bill belongs to a number of other people that came up in their context. And again, a lot of mashes get rounded down. So when you look at like 0 to 3 rye percent, which is what tended to come up when rye was a thing in Irish pot still, you either round down to 0 and you get what we just had, or you round up to 5 and you get this. So Boann was picked as a convenient name for this concept. But anyway, and again, the same. You get this weird tumbling order mash bill, and the tumbling order mash bill is what 19th century powers were using. Jameson, Tullamore, Bandon, seemingly Pearses out in Galway. It was at its time seen as a prestige mash bill. This like 1 to 3% rye, say like 4 to 8% wheat, and then say like 15 to 18% oats. And then if you were in Dublin, 40 to 50% malt. And if you were down the country, 30 to 40% malt. And the rest is raw barley on all sides. But this tumbling order, which I know you guys have now adopted as a house mash bill in a more specific regimen, but that tumbling order for a long time was what commanded the Victorian marketplace. And either you wind the rye down for the sake of decimalization and you get what we had last, or you get rid of the rye for the sake of history as rye disappeared and you get what we had last. But similarly, going in the other direction, you get this. But this would be more of a rural prestige mash bill than a Dublin one because the malt content is lower. But anyway, and almonds of Bandon would have fit into that milieu very well. So they're one of a cadre, as it were. So I don't want people thinking this is just Bandon. But it is an easy kind of reference point. And one that thankfully is not currently owned by anyone. But yeah, you are getting that five. The history, we're getting to the last adjunct and the one that was the smallest. Rye has an interesting, first of all, rye has been grown in Ireland since the Middle Ages, yet Ireland has no real history of rye brewing, no real history of rye bread. It was mainly a cover crop to rejuvenate soil, essentially between crops. So there is a history of rye in Ireland. There's places, the Irish for rye is Chagall. So you get like Cap and Taggle, all these places. That anything that ends in aggle is probably to do with rye. And it's funny because you look at like French and Italian, siècle and so forth. It's clearly, it could well have been brought in by the Normans. But anyway, it's there, but you don't have the history. Rye likes cold, dry environments to grow, which is why it likes Canada, which is why it likes Central Europe and Eastern Europe, and Ireland is only one of those two things. It's just cold, it's not dry. But
it's probably worth mentioning on growing barley, or rye, I should say, as well, is the height of Ireland's probably not suited to it because of the height. It grows to about 6 foot tall, and so especially this time of year now where most of the nutrients from the actual crop has gone to the head or into the actual grains themselves, it becomes very, very top heavy at 6 foot tall. If you can, it's built just like a grass, and it's standing 6 foot tall. It doesn't take much of a puff of wind to knock it over, and it wouldn't take much of a shower of rain to just flatten the crop. So that's one of the challenges in growing rye. It can grow quite readily, but it's where it probably hasn't gone. Maybe it could go through the same level of genetic modification as barley and whatever to shorten the actual height of the crop, and it would be more suitable. But for whatever reason, it hasn't gone through the same level of product development or crop development as the other adjunct grains. And so when we call up to the guys in Dromiskin, Loughran's, who grow the rye for us, it's literally head height, and so it's an
I'm much smaller than you, so I get lost in there.
Yeah, so
you can just about see over it, but
you'd be lost, and it's genuinely.
I've seen those dramatic photos of Michael walking through Loughran's field. Yeah,
there's a team of us walking through the field, but you can just about see my head over the top of it. Is about it. So it's a nervy couple of weeks for the Loughran's and for ourselves now to see if we'll get this crop in this year, just because of the actual height of the grain. It's more susceptible to being, even though it's a very sturdy. Relatively speaking, is very sturdy, but it's just that physics of being 6 foot tall that doesn't necessarily go. It's not necessarily going to do very well in the west of Ireland. I'll put it that way. But anyway.
Well, yeah, it's an odd one, and I mean, I had a chat with a good friend who comes to the Irish Whisky Society often enough, but he has a very different background. But I remember him a very different background in like hard economics. And he talked to me about dwarf wheat once, and how the reason we're able to feed the population we currently have globally is because of the invention, the domestication of dwarf wheat. And you look at the dependence that mankind has shoveled onto wheat, and rye never went through that, so there hasn't been that specialization of rye. We haven't been obliged to dwarf it. I to this day don't understand why dwarf wheat is something there's any more of it, and why that's so important to feeding the world population. But apparently it's quite a big deal. But rye is such an odd one, and it's been there again for a long time. But then you look in for instance, the Netherlands, Genever or Ginevra, as it became known, or as gin. Later on, the ancestor to gin as any real gin fan will know, comes from the Netherlands, from a rye distillate given juniper and compounded with other stuff, and then put in a cask. So almost like a weird, like semi-relative to whiskey. But there is this history of rye distilling in continental Europe that doesn't really happen in Ireland, despite the fact there's rye there from, again, the Middle Ages, like a text I've spoken to Matty about at length, and Fionnán Sullivan, who Mick was on the panel up north, and Fionnán was meant to be down in Dublin. I think she's stuck in Australia, but another Irish chef. But there's a text called the Ashling Macham Glynna, which the dream of Macham Glynna, which is the best reference we have to medieval Irish food. And it's a chieftain in Cork who is possessed by a demon of gluttony, and a scribe comes to like lure it out of him. They chain him to a pole, and the scribe describes a big rock candy mountain, essentially like a world made of food, and the guy is fucking convulsing and the demon comes out of him. But it's a great resource because it tells us what people were drinking during this Hiberno-Norman period. And anyway, one of the things that's mentioned is rye, and so it has been there, but it was never part of the whiskey. And then in the 1850 to 1950 kind of century, rye starts being peppered into Irish pot still. And that's why this one was labeled as Edwardian rye tinting. Well, I'm not sure if this one was or the other one, but they're both Edwardian rye tinting. And they're both part of that same phenomenon of like rye being added in. And you get this tumbling, and rye, and like I adore rye whiskey. As I think I said at a tasting in this festival last night, my three heartthrobs are Islay malt, like peaty malt whiskey done well, and Irish pot still, and like really musty, oily Irish pot still, like trad pot kind of stuff, and American rye, like Pennsylvania rye, really bristly, dry, distillate forward, confident whiskey.
You're the classic hipster whiskey consumer then, Fionnán, yeah?
Yeah. Well, I'm not a hipster. Like, you look at my dress sense, I'm not a hipster in any other sense, so I might as well like cling to some form of cultural relevance. I don't, compute well. I don't, everything else I've failed to keep up with my generation. But at least in whiskey, I can be the most cutting edge hipster you imagine. I have like great manual incompetence. I can't put things together, so I'd be a terrible.
The whole monastic diet sounded very hipster, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, that'll be the next big thing. I'll strike out like Gwyneth Paltrow or something. I'll start a new YouTube channel about the monastic, the Goidelic monastic diet. We'll sweep, YouTube channels across the world. But anyway, this particular distillate, now that we can finally crack onto it, despite me taking up loads of time talking about other stuff, you give it a smell. Strawberry milkshake is the closest I've come. That weird, like, if anyone's ever been to California, like In and Out strawberry milkshake, that weird, like, American diner American milkshake smell. Strawberry milkshake, shortcake, real like strawberry shortcake. So again, you're getting from the 5% rye, from that small adjunct of rye, from 10% wheat. So you've got more wheat in this than you had in the other one, but less wheat than you had in the first two we did, the 15 to 30. So you've got a good cereal, savory note, cream cheesy note, but then with that rye sharpness. And what you end up with is like strawberry shortcake kind of crack. And then you get the oats, 15% oats, constant with the last one we had. So the same amount of wedding cake, same amount of glycerin, vanilla, frosting, all those top notes. And then you get your malt and your raw barley. And for me, it just smells like... You ever been to the Cheesecake Factory or any of these places in America? Ever had proper American like strawberry shortcake? You like this weird mix between cream cheese and strawberries. And this is what that smells like. It's like you took strawberries and you tried to create cream cheese out of them, and then
I think we need to teach Fionnán how you make cream cheese.
I have no idea how you make cream cheese. I actually, of course, cheese is a weird one because, again, back to that medieval history, there's a weird, fascinating history around medieval Irish cheese. So, like, in the Ulster cycle,
I might have to keep you on topic for just the tail end of this.
I was hoping to find the link between monastic medieval Ireland and the cheesecake factory. I was hoping there would be a connection.
Yeah. Matt, you're nil crack on this one.
Well, you see, we have a fine period after we've one distillate left that we can talk about the monastic origins of cheese, perhaps. But I might just have to keep you on
no problem.
What are your, I suppose, Michael, your flavor notes you're getting out of this distillate?
Yeah, like a lot of what Fionnán was saying there. What it reminded me of when I had it, we had in when I went into secondary school, there was a little what a Polski schelp. There was a little Polish shop, and they had all exotic foods and exotic sweets, and they had a little they're called like Campino. They were cream and different various fruits, but my favorite were the cream and strawberry. They were little hard boiled sweets, and this has brought me straight back to that. You're getting that creaminess coming through from the wheat, and then in combination with the oats. In combination with the oats, it's turning it into that. Like you have the pastry characteristic there, but it's more when you combine it with the oats, you're getting it. Translated into this kind of strawberry like ripe fruit kind of a character, and then just in the back you have that little subtle perforation of that like white pepper cracking of that's can only be attributed, I think, to that rye whiskey, the rye influence on the whiskey, I should say.
This is. It's funny because we've tasted these so many times, and I have preconceived opinions about the flavors of different things and what each one tastes like. And one of the things that I've been delighted about is that pretty much all of them have been even more stellar than I remember them being. But this one in particular, for me, really jumps out of the glass as a fantastic whiskey. And if you don't mind, I think it's probably just about time to jump on to the 10th mash bill. And as I said, we will have time and ample opportunity to speak of all of the different points of what we're talking about tonight and answer any questions you guys have. So if you have any questions that you want to ask Michael or Fionnán, or perhaps just more generally to the distillery.
If you don't mind, Matt, can I just go through very quickly my thoughts on the palate of the ninth just before we leave?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
No, it's just because I know I spent the whole time, my little portion where I should have been talking about the whiskey, I spent talking about me being on a monastic diet. But very, very quickly, for anyone who's a slow enough drinker to still have it in your taste, there is that weird milkshake taste. There is that weird, I'm like, the icing in the soda bread is still there from again, that oat, what seems to be the like trait of the oats. Like one is that powdery, baker sugar, and the other is that soda bread kind of taste. And that's as savory as oats seem to get. But then you get this weird, like, and this is rye. And this is why I said I love rye whiskey along with my other two great favorites. And I was out in Kentucky and I was staying with this guy, Colin. And Colin runs an organization called Moonshine University. It's a staff training thing for various distilleries out in Kentucky. And Colin is a lovely guy. I think the world of Colin. But Colin took me around to various distilleries that were working with high rye bourbon, because that was something I was interested in. Within a bourbon context, what happens as rye escalates. And one thing I kept seeing, and especially when I was getting pure rye whiskey, you hear about rye spice in bourbon, but when you get into pure rye and higher rye, even higher rye bourbon, you get this weird like sandalwood kind of smell. It's so odd. We did an American tasting with the Irish Whiskey Society where we had Kentucky Owl rye, not the bourbon, the rye, and there was this wonderful kind of potpourri smell. It's like dead flowers smell, dead lavender smell, and rye is such an aromatic additive. And when I was trying the 9, again, my nickname for it used to be strawberry cheesecake and a bag of Roman candles. And the Roman candles is the rye, because you get that smell, that weird And if there's any Americans watching, what we would call candy floss and what people in America would call cotton candy, that weird, like synthetic, sharp strawberry, but is that coming from the rye meeting the like vanilla glycerin from the oats? But then you also get this like health bowl. And like, I used to live in bloody Berkeley. I've had bloody fruit in a yogurt ball plenty of times. But it smells like that as well. You know, I adore rye whiskey. And like pure rye, like old Pennsylvania, you know, not this like rye that dreamt of being bourbon kind of crack, but like actual high rye whiskey, a rye with a bit of barley even. And trying these pot stills and wondering why the hell did they put 0 to 5% rye within them? And what happens when you round up and you say, right, okay, we'll do 5, 10, 15. This is the tumbling order mash bill, and see what we get. And the rye is so aggressive and so fun and so strange. And you get this, like, again, I think what I call fancy hotel bowl of potpourri, this like dead lavender smell. And at the same time, you get this like cheesecake crack, milkshake crack from what's clearly the 10% wheat having to cope with the vanilla, the icing from the oats, and the kick from the rye, but not just kick, not just spice, not just cinnamon, not stuff people talk about in bourbon, but this weird like potpourri kind of angle, this weird lavender angle, this weird floral side of rye, and you end up with like something that tastes like smell like an In-N-Out milkshake, and then you give it a taste. And give it a bit of liquid in there, and you get that classic pot still oil, you know, that crackle, that ginger spry grin from Irish pot still is so there. This is not American rye. And I know a lot of the Irish pot still technophile dispute revolved around the obligation of Kilbeggan, what was called Kilbeggan rye, to call itself Kilbeggan rye, despite being an Irish pot still. You know, despite being 30% rye and the rest 40% raw barley and 30% malt, which is funny because that's the other two remnants. And I spent an awful lot of time with the Locks archive, and the great irony to that is that Locks was not that mash bill. Locks was a much more dialed down version of rye, and I think what happened was Alex Chasko, who was head of innovation, saw rye, and your man Brian saw rye, and Alex was allowed to work with a mash bill that would fit his inclinations and his vision on that basis. But no, even Locks was not that mash bill. But it is a very good example accidentally of what went wrong, and a great test case, because of course that Locks, that Kilbeggan rye, which is 30% rye, is now the test zone of where Irish pot still can be, because it is 30% maxed out of the adjunct that had the least to do with the history. So that is as far as that whiskey can stray from green spot. And it's a fantastic example because it doesn't taste like American rye. And I say that as a great lover of American, and particularly like old school, like high rye whiskey. It tastes like Irish pot still with rye in it, in the same way that this tastes like Irish pot still with rye in it. You know, but it still has that ginger. Even that cream soda from mash bill number 1 is still there, you know, and you wonder, what the fuck will this do in rum? What the hell will this do in Neoc? There's so much to play about where this all goes. It is so exciting to be here at this pivotal moment, and this enormous, and like, I had two panels, and I know we were obliged by COVID to put them into, the original plan was we would bring them all to Grange Gorman, the new TU Dublin culinary campus, the replacement to Cal Brewery, which is enormous and so much fun. I mean, the big problem in Ireland is no one wants to become a chef, and we rely on hospitality. And these two things are fundamentally at odds. And the government has responded by pumping money into what used to be Cal Brewery, into the premier, you know, cooking school in Ireland, and it's now been put in Grange Gorman with massive equipment, huge. And I wish, Michael, you were on for that walking tour.
It was absolutely incredible, the facility they have out there. Absolutely, literally, I nearly thought about going back to college myself just to learn. Now, I'd need more than 4 years to teach me how to cook, but if there was a facility,
bring everybody into that space and have a big day of it. and we were robbed of that, by COVID. We had to do two halves, and we had all the Scots come to Belfast and blah, 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 and do one here and do one there. But even in that refracted light, there was this huge industry goodwill towards what we're doing, towards the spirit of the project. And I encourage all these guys, everyone who was on that panel, whether it be David or Louise or whoever, to make stuff or commission stuff or whatever from their taste buds, from their and play with it, Pete it, Balti, whatever. This is the beginning of the story rather than the end. But it is so invigorating to be here. And of course, the first category of that is not historical is to bump rye up. But it is amazing to me that even with 5% rye, it was, and there's a great bit in the What is Whiskey trial. If you ever want to cancel Scottish whiskey, you ever want to get them a little bit of heat on their breath, there's a great bit in the trial where they start talking about like who is truly indigenous to America, and blah blah blah. Is it the black man and blah blah? There's some weird stuff that comes up, but there's the idea that rye has always been indigenous to Ireland, but was never a big deal and a huge part of their end.
Now we haven't lost Fionnán, have we?
I mean, it's quite the moment to lose him. He always seems to manage to cancel himself out at a fantastic freeze frame. Saving him coming back.
All this stuff is on their end. This again, like, why would you start using rye at this point, and what does it mean? And then you get again this high era Dublin and / Dublin's confreres outside of Dublin, Tullamore, etc., Bandon down in Cork, all these people, Pearses out in Galway, these complex mash bills.
All good, Fionnán?
I'm grand. Are you guys? I've been told we're not on air.
No, you dropped out for a split second, but you're back. You're back.
Oh, so are you guys. But I think that's to do with all of us.
That's okay. But please continue, Fionnán.
Anyway, so finally, as Matty was saying, lugging on to our last spirit, I really want to get that in that bridge between the two.
That's not a problem at all. Well, then now I was a little premature, but we're here now. Mash bill number 10. Our final mash bill of the evening. It has a perfect little tasting card here, Edwardian rye tinting. Now, Fionnán, it says here 1892 to 1930. Do you want to just go into that very quickly, and then we can hit the glass itself?
Yeah. Sorry, water. Yeah. Sorry, I this poor man is responsible for all the tech support and also like my petty needs of water and this
with this water.
Yeah. Just rinse it out and fill it with the old Ishka. But yeah, okay. So 10 is a real heartthrob for me. 9 is like a decimalized version of like 1890s Jameson, Powers, all the big boys. When they were in their form, what they did, and there's this great, again, during the What is Whiskey trial, during the like sketchy description of who the fuck is from North America and who's whatever, and is corn planted in Ireland, the same thing. But during that description, you get this tumbling order mash bill from Andrew Jameson. The Andrew Jameson who ran the Bank of Ireland, because these were prominent individuals. The Roes were, Henry Roe was Lord Mayor of Dublin. I mean, there's a famous restaurant. In fact, my thesis advisor's thesis once upon a time was about Jamais, the first fine restaurant in Dublin. And the chef of Jamais was invited to Dublin by Henry Roe, a distiller who had become so wealthy that he could afford fine French cuisine to be brought to him, and it brings in French, culinary understanding and all this crack, and there is this relationship. They were men done well, And bit of trivia: Jamais, the original, and it used to be called Corley's or whatever. It appears in Dubliners and James Joyce is a place where foreign diplomats went and drank cocktails, But this idea of like French food coming into service, well done distillers, there is this bizarre link. But anyway, it's where the Porterhouse Central is now. What used to be what's the name of that nightclub that was above there for ages?
Lily's.
That's where Jamais was. So poor Oliver. And I mean, Oliver, I know Oliver was a big influence on you, Michael, but poor Oliver, I only discovered that much later on, that the reason Jamais existed, this fine restaurant, the birth of French food in Ireland, existed because of the wealth of Roe and Co. distillers, or of Roe's distillery at the time, and of Henry Roe personally, and he could afford to invite a French chef to come in and make, and that became the finest. Anyone in Dublin went to eat at Jamais, and that legacy of connection is so tied to whiskey. And it's weird, like, I'll put it this way, I was on a Stonning tasting recently, and I was blown away. If you ever heard of Noma, I don't speak Danish. It's not among my various invested skill sets to speak Danish, but there's a lot of fuss around Danish and Scandinavian food in general now. There used to be old French cuisine, and then there was Alice Waters and Thomas Kelleher and the kind of new West Coast American scene, the farm to table movement, etc. And now all the fuss seems to be about new Nordic cuisine, and there's loads of stuff about experimental cuisine. All this crap that's going on in Scandinavia. Scandinavia seems to be, well, has been for a little while now, the most experimental place in haute cuisine globally. And there's a restaurant in Denmark called Noma, which apparently sounds like Nordic cuisine, such and such. But anyway, there's a distillery out there called Stonning, and Stonning make rye whiskey out there, and a fun peated rye. No history of whiskey in Denmark, but they make fun stuff, and it gets showcased in this restaurant. Probably the most famous restaurant on the planet as of now. Noma. Everybody wants to talk about Noma, and Noma delisted Johnny Walker, Jameson, Jack Daniels, every other whiskey from. Have we lost them? Jeez,
no.
The best bits. Yeah, so delisted everything. So a customer at Noma is only confronted with this Danish peated rye whiskey. And I remember thinking, like, my God, we invented bloody whiskey. You'd be hard pressed to go to a restaurant, even in Dingle, and say, like, would you delist everything but Dingle whiskey? Would you only carry Dingle whiskey? And your customers will appreciate the confidence of that decision. And I just have a bar of Dingle, and we are so behind in Ireland in terms of how we think about the product, how we think about cuisine, how we think about food. But when you look at what is being done globally, my big hope is that we will understand what we have, understand this pot still heritage, understand the diversity, understand its links with food, understand the enormous birthright we were given, and take it bloody well seriously, because the stuff is fucking gorgeous. And it is and you look at like Irish cuisine, in the Middle Ages was really kooky and weird and involved a lot of buttermilk and oysters and all kinds of crack. And then was leveled by the potato, and it became really boring, and it's only like rediscovering all this stuff. But there's so much there. Take a bloody pride in the place. Is there, whatever. And this last whiskey kind of touches into that. If I can find this bloody last whiskey. Oh, here it is. Rye for me always reminds me of the three great love affairs of my life, none of which were people. One was Pennsylvania rye, the other of which was experimental global whiskey, and the third was hankering after what rye was in Irish pot still and trying to recuperate that. And this is and I've been asked a lot by usually people who've bought casks and want to know which cask they've bought and what cask they should buy. And if I can put that question to bed, because I shouldn't, my whole angle from this has been to absolve myself from the selling of the cask. And I did ask Boann, and Boann were lovely about selling the cask privately, because again, I've got all this bloody data from all these bloody distillers. We've got everybody. Oh, she's falling on the floor.
Do not lose it for now.
But the promise is that they're not contributing to fucking Boann's research and development program, so it doesn't become a branch. It's all sold out. I think the biggest buyers were Paul Kane of Belfast Whiskey Week and Ali Alpine of Celtic Whiskey Shop. And they both bought 10 casks. They're all petty buyers, small, this and that. And we got like Daithí O'Connell out of WD O'Connell. We got Shane out of Toothtax. Louise out of Clare. Matt did all the bottle distribution, and again, I kept away from it. And Matt would come down once a day and say, like, "You won't believe who bought a cask," kind of stuff, So, fair play to Matt for distributing the cask as fraternally as possible, and any bonders who had a sincere. Any bonders, any distilleries, whatever, clubs. We got Kilkenny, we got a lot of bars, the Kilkenny Whiskey Guild, Palace Bar, Dick Max, loads of people who have shown so much love to the project about how you disseminate this stuff and how you make it publicly accessible. Because this spirit is the last. Like, we held a bit to do the bloody panel tastings, the 26 master blenders and distillers and adjacent critics tastings that we had done, but that's it. Everything else was in a bloody barrel, and thanks to COVID, it's all 6 months old now. This is gone. We never get to try this again as Spirit, and we only get to be on the new adventure of seeing where it goes. But this last one is my favorite, if only because it was to do with the nostalgia of the process, and that's what I'll say to anyone who should ask me, "What's your favorite?" My favorites are just stacked up in the process of finding them. They're nothing to do with the distillate. I spent more time with this archive than the other, and found something, and I was delighted by it. And I can't divorce myself from that process. So the last whiskey is number 10, which is the Kilbeggan, which is the first archive I dealt with. So again, it is my favorite, but only because it was the first archive.
Well, we have a little nose and a little sip. Michael, and what are your thoughts on the nose of this one?
Let me gather myself and pour myself a drop first. But this is close on my dream mash bill out of the whole project. In that it has a little bit of rye, it has a little bit of oat. I would have maybe given my dream mash bill a little bit more barley than malt, but this is it's that gorgeous example of what happens when you have all that sweetness, enough of the sweetness coming through from the malt. You have that zestiness, that citrus fruit skin element coming through from the oats. Both are manipulated in from the oats into that citrus peel skin kind of an element, but also that sugar dusting. It's maybe not as viscous and as oily as some of the earlier examples, and I love that. Like, if we're talking about nostalgia and if we're talking about dreaming things up in our mind, I love that oily viscosity that comes from keeping that barley content high. But yeah, that's up there. It's a beautiful, like, you have all that sherbet sweetness, you have a bit of fruit character.
I have a lot of growth for this whiskey, my God, because you've taken like, if the 40-40-15-5 was what was in 1950s and 60s pot still, full stop, unless you get outliers like Cork Distillers using just a little bit of oats, or Cumbria using a good whack of oats. But you're talking about the Dublin crowd and that, like, Canal Side, Lochs and Tullamore, like Dublin colony in the Midlands, that's what it was. But Tullamore, Lochs, which is the first archive I spent a lot of time with. It is so publicly available. I can give people the numbers, and the stuff is so gorgeous. It's so wonderful. And I remember talking to John Cashman about the history of that archive, because he said, oh, we were given the same opportunity IDL where we could host it privately and poke into it ourselves, but we decided we didn't have the setup and whatever, and we just leave it where it was. And thank fuck for that decision, because the stuff was left alone. And I remember going into it, and there is this weird 1920s lox is 15% oats, 5% rye, roughly 40% malt, 40% raw barley. It is not the Kilbeggan rye, despite how much noise that made, and rightly so, but that was not correct. But it was rye tinted pot still. And you get that smell and higher raw barley, and it's just, nobody should be making pot still lower than 40%. There's a few people making double distilled pot still that's lower than 40, and it still tastes really pot stilly. But like, raw barley is so important and so fun. And I would urge those double distilled 30-70 distillers, two of them that I know are on here tonight and that I think the world of, beef your game up and see how that goes, because this raw barley is so much fun. And you get this weird like felt tip marker, gingerbread, ginger, actual cut ginger, mixed with cream soda ginger, and then the rye, and that's 5% rye, and that's as high as the historical mash bills go. Rye was always a peppering agent, except in column stills where it was a big agent. But in Irish pot still, rye was always the third and the last of mash bills, and it is so cool. And I you know, the nickname I gave that was the fruit of that marker. You know, it's nectarine. You know, nectarine is a man-made fruit, by the way. It's a synthetic fruit. Nectarines don't exist in the wild. It was like a peach and something else that were bred together to create nectarines. There's that weird, like, okay, so when I was on that tour with Connor, or not Connor, Colin out in Kentucky, doing the guy from Moonshine University, this bourbon distilling consultant, and I was trying all these high ryes that I really loved, and I was getting this weird felt tip marker, acetone kind of edge off of them, and I loved it. You know, I went out to Willet, who have a small batch bourbon, a small batch rye, and one. They have two pure ryes. One they did themselves, and one was done up at MGP. And both those, but particularly the one they did themselves, have that felt tip marker smell. And the acetone, it's not quite fruit. It's too synthetic to be fruit at that point. And it works so well with that ginger, with that bristle, with that oil to buoy it up. You know, and with this one, the closest I can come to is described like HB, you know, like the strawberry shortcake ice cream. You know that.
I've said it once or twice about him freezing in good positions. Where's my now Fionnán? HB ice creams where you left us off.
Oh, he's gone again, is he?
Oh, he might be having a few technical difficulties up in Duke York. For me, I think on particularly the palate of this, the nose is delightful, but the palate is just so expressive. And you know, one of the things I found very interesting about rye is that it's just a small amount has such a huge impact on the spirit. And I think it interplays with the oats fantastically in this whiskey. And I can see a lot of people in the comments very much enjoying their samples as well. For me, I think if I was, as Fionnán mentioned earlier, if I was in the position to be looking at casks, and you know, there's a preference list coming up of the cask owners, and they'll be trying all these whiskeys tonight and over the next coming days and trying to make their picks. I think it'd be very difficult for me to choose my favorite mash bill out of these, because everything, you know, has such a wonderful palate and nose onto itself. And if anyone is listening in who is trying any of these samples, we've now tried all 10. We've capped the actual liquid sampling, which was the most important part from a moderating point of view, that we wanted to make sure that we did get through all of the samples But if you have a favorite or a top three of the evening, make sure to pop them into the comments section, because everyone's taste is subjective, and out of sheer curiosity, I'd just be happy to start poking around and see what whiskeys people have enjoyed. Is there a grain that stood out for you, Michael, as your favorite as you're tasting through, rather than a distillate, but perhaps a grain?
I'm in training to be a politician, I suppose. I don't have favorites within it. I found the whole look, if I'm being blunt about it, I found the whole project tiring and exhausting and everything else, but all leaving aside all of that, I found it absolutely fascinating. From I think I've learned more in an 8-week period than distillers have learned in generations. Like, I don't know that has ever been done where you've taken down and literally done something like this, where we compared such a broad range, not just hypothetically speaking, not just talking about, oh, I like Pennsylvanian rye, or I like Scotch single malt, or I like whatever else, that we could take this level of such a broad scope of mash bills. And certainly I've had favorites. I've had patterns that I've seen develop that I preferred over others. But no, I applied for a mortgage, and I took the money, the down payment for the mortgage, and I bought a cask of each, because I was so not to blow my own trumpet, it's not necessarily my trumpet, it's all learnings from the past, and mash bills that I borrowed are being taken from the past. I've been so impressed by them. I actually had to own at least a cask of each. I don't know if I'll ever financially, was it Joe Exotic, another lockdown? I will never financially recover from this, but I'll have some excellent whiskey to show for it. But no, an absolutely fascinating project. Like, I mean, and so much. I loved the textures and the things that Fionnán it brought back. Whiskey tasting can be so visual, and I don't need to say that in Fionnán's presence when he's talking about the exotic, the Chinese takeaway and wedding cake kind of levels of tasting notes. But silly things like, I don't know, it was a mash bill 7 or 8 where you had that weird mix of like, it's like sour, where we had high wheat, where it's like it's milk, but it's kind of sour, and you have green apple, and just reminded me of, like, I grew up in a dairy farm where I spent my early teens carrying buckets of milk over to calf sheds to feed, and you have this weird thing that happens over where you wear the same farm clothes every day, and you'd have like bits of milk soaking in, where it's kind of sweet and kind of milky, but it's also kind of the most horrendous smell you've ever smelled in your life. And at the end of the day, like, my grandmother was a lovely woman, but her idea of treats were terrible. So, but perfect for whiskey tasting notes. So it was raisins, green apples, or seaweed. And so I guess that green apple, milk wafer, and ice cream and stuff, that was a treat after an end of the day farming. And I see that all over mash bill 7. I see, like, there's so much, the sherbet, there's sweetness, there's so much interesting, and I hope that the most important thing, I've been inspired. I can't wait until the day that we start laying down, or we start distilling a 30% rye mash bill. I have my dream mash bill is not even covered, like I said tonight. Where I want to take this project, or the learnings from this project, goes beyond not replicating what we've done tonight, but pushing the boundaries even further. And I hope there's distillers and distilleries and whiskey fans as well that will drive this, because it's not to be underestimated, the power of a Belfast Whiskey Week. If fellas come out of a Belfast Whiskey Week talking about the influence of oats in a mash bill, distillers change their production methods. As much as Fionnán has tried to break down grain prices or whatever, it's seemingly the most innocuous things that change production outputs of distilleries. So I hope that we have inspired or helped to inspire distilleries, not just tonight, but the whole project, and the learnings that we've done. I hope that the mistakes we've made, that it helps answer questions, and helps to change and shift towards more of this stuff being made. Like, I've absolutely enjoyed the project, but like the end products are absolutely phenomenal, and I know they can be improved upon, not only by myself, but I know they can be improved upon by other distilleries. So that'll be the exciting thing. That's the whatever about how exciting tonight was, and the waiting for these distillates to mature. The exciting thing is to see what name distilleries, but other distilleries will do with this knowledge and this research as well.
Exactly. And one thing Fionnán touched on earlier that I think is very important to mention as well is that we pretty much used every single drop of these distillates in either his academic tastings or in these packs. So, of these boxes that the Cooney family created, there's only 500 packs, and it's not like batch one is 500 packs. There are only 500 packs, and that's it. For as you say, all the distillates are in cask. We'll never have the opportunity to taste these as new makes again. So this has been, for me at least, a historic tasting in my history book of whiskey, I've very much appreciated everyone being here, being a part of that. For the fact that, Michael, you've not only gone through a huge amount of work, taking Fionnán's ideas and research and distilling them, but then also coming on every single live stream and podcast and talking about them in either redacted forms or now in an open form. And the Cooney family for taking that risk to create these distillates. That a lot of distilleries have distilled kind of extra different types of mash bills, but not in this systematic kind of format that Fionnán and yourself kind of created. And is seeing the incremental differences that the different styles of grain offer from mash bill 1 through 10, whether it be oat, wheat, or rye, I think is hopefully, like you said, perhaps a building block or at least a fascination point for distillers to come after this tasting, or even distillers who are already doing it, who just like something else that they might have seen and increase the interest in the category. Because I know from Fionnán's point of view, I think that the research is open, the recipes are easily found. He's not keeping anything close to his chest, and they're certainly not our possessions either. So
that might, no, not to jump in and to speak for Fionnán, but that might seem like an honourable thing, aren't we? We're such an open book. But to be blunt about it, as much as I might have professional gain to keep this thing secret, the reality, the most selfish thing I could do is open this thing up to the broader distilling sphere and hope that some of the other 30, 40 odd distilleries turn around and make this distillate. Because look, the most exciting thing I could look forward to in the near to distant future is that other distilleries start doing amazing distillate. Like, as much as you might, like he was talking about Redbreast Gilbeys or whatever, like, and that they get open readily. It's not too often in my company that I get to taste Redbreast Gilbey or anything else from these. And it's never depreciating asset. There's not too many of these bottles left knocking around. The only way, like, I think Irish pots of whiskey, I think Fionnán, was the point he was making before he got cut off, was we have a little island and we don't give ourselves enough credit for the amazing things that we have here on the island. And I grew up on a farm. It's dairy farm. It's very different to a farm that produces oats, wheat, rye, barley, but we produce as good, if not better, barley, oats, wheat, rye than anybody else. We have the distilling talent and now the distilleries to match that are as good or better than anything on the planet. We have a level of passion, as is evidenced by the way that Fionnán speaks, but you don't have to just speak to Fionnán. You can see it if you go around to any of these 30 or 40 distilleries, a passion, a drive to produce an absolutely world class. It was viewed at one time in history as the leading highest quality standard bearer of distillate. And there's no reason that it shouldn't be viewed at that again. We have the best grain, we have the best technology, and we have the best of distillers. And I only hope that they take up some learnings from what we have. They might pick up on some things that we missed out on. They might learn some little bits of tricks and learn some mistakes that we made along the way, because it's such, like, I mean, honestly, there's we're falling over fields of barley, we're falling over fields of oats. We could grow oats on any corner of this country with a little bit slightly more difficulty. We could grow as much rye as you'd want, and all around us there in the Boann Valley above near the distillery, it's literally, as far as I go up on top of the silos, and every field around us is turning a golden color now as the wheat ripens. There's no reason at all that we could not take these mash bills and improve upon them, and make distillates that absolutely, pardon my French, beat the absolute piss out of anything that's produced in America, Scotland, or anywhere else. They couldn't come close to what we produce here, because they don't have the raw materials that we have here at our disposal. And what Fionnán has hopefully proven tonight, and will continue to prove as his research and his research becomes more public, there's absolutely incredible. Basically, I've said this before, cheat codes that are disposable. We have generations upon generations of highly successful distillers that made some of the best distillates that have ever graced this planet, and we found out now how they did it, and we have all the raw materials and all of the ability to do it again. We don't even have to be creative. So I hope it's inspired others, because it certainly has inspired me as a relatively young distiller, and hopefully a long future ahead of me. I know that I've taken a lot of learnings and a lot of inspiration from Fionnán's work, and what Fionnán's work is, which is discovering the work of our predecessors. So I hope there's I'm not the only one that's taken inspiration, to put it that way.
Fionnán, do you have any parting words about this enterprise?
Yeah, most of the comments of it were, deeply uninspiring, boring. Wish I hadn't got out here for the day. Waste of my time. I could have been filling malt. At this moment, I could have been running what we were running before. Michael's an outlier. And from one outlier to another, it is fun. It is weird. And there is this space, and there was a lot of love from the category. After the Dublin panel, we were out with John Quinn, who is the chairman of the Irish Whisky Association. From the formal side of the trade, there has been love. There has been interest. It's not just me rabble rousing. There has been a raised eyebrow, and that's a huge relief in itself. The people were curious, that there was this space to reinvent the category, but not reinvent the category, just take the past and take it seriously. Because what we were doing before, ironically, was reinventing the category, trying to turn ourselves, and I know I've talked to you about this, Matt, into kind of like a fucking Toontown Scotch, and try and say that Irish whiskey is an unpeated malt Scotch and blah, 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 and all this crack. And you have this enormous culinary wellspring to draw from, of that glycerin vanilla from the oats, of that slight weirdy lavender potpourri from the rye, cutthroat spice from the rye as well, and that like more familiar, but in many ways quite estranged by what it's in company with, raw barley oil and raw barley ginger and all this stuff. And what the fuck do you do with it when you were born in an industry that had all this stuff and it all died off, and you have the equipment of better oak and better procedures and all this stuff to add? Because modern whiskey leans in heavily into wood, because wood is so much better than it was before. And the same with the old era industry led heavily into spirit, because spirit was all they had to give. I think, what if you took this and you put in whatever oak? What could you concoct? And it is so fun to be here at ground zero and to see the bloody rocket launch and not see Apollo, whatever it was, the one that launched on site or imploded on site.
Daddy didn't say that implosion on site when he came towards us and proposed the whole idea.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps that wouldn't have convinced the Cooney family to have run the project, but
Yeah, we were told it was a bad idea, but we weren't told about implosions on site.
I do want to say that I'm delighted that Fionnán's internet problems happened essentially after the 10th mash bill. So we made it through 3 and a bit hours of no problems, and now obviously having a few technical difficulties up in the Duke of York. In lieu of Fionnán saying a proper goodbye, Michael, I know that it's been a long project for you, and I'm sure you're very happy to see it having the light of day. And I'm sure you'll be very excited to see how the spirit matures in 4 different cast types that was laid down in.
Yeah, like the way I genuinely view this is the beginning. Like we, as much as it's an exploration of the past, the whole purpose, I'm sure Fionnán will echo this. The whole purpose of it wasn't an exploration of the past; it was to inspire the future. Like we have to say what I just said a second ago. We have so much quality raw materials. Every one of us is only a generation or two away from a farmer that was able to produce some sort of quality product, and grains are still the product that we can probably produce at the highest quality with the minimum of effort. We have the best of barley, we have the best of oats, we have the best of rye, we have the best of wheat. Why not produce the best whiskey with those? And I suppose the reason that has held that back was that it's don't go near oats, it's too high in beta glucans, don't go where blah 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 blah. We know now what happens, or we actually have a far clearer idea what happens from a very controlled. And if there's anybody that needs any more information, I'll happy to stay on all night to talk about this project, but I'll happily welcome anybody to the distillery or elsewhere to talk about this project if it helps to inspire anybody to make more of this style of distillate. It's why not? We have to, again, say it for a third or fourth time, we have the best raw ingredients on this little rocky outcrop hanging off the edge of Europe. We have the best of raw ingredients to make the best of whiskey, and I think we're at a position now where we have actually a level of enthusiasm and a level of passion and a standard of distilling equipment on this island to produce amazing products. And as is evident by the amount of people that bought these packs this evening, a lot of people that are interested in actually trying this distillate. So if the people are interested in trying the raw spirit, I'm sure that there will be a lot more people that would be interested in seeing this as a 7-year-old or a 10-year-old. So it was a lot of hard work. It was a lot of research, and then not only for me, every single one of the lads that works in Boann Distillery that was involved in this project are actually absolute Trojan workers. The Coonies have been mentioned a few times, and they will never not be mentioned enough. For the financial element, they took a big financial hit to do this. The guys that were involved from a production element, the Alex, Colum, Ludo, Marius, Callum, Gary, Marius, every one of them, they put their weight work behind it. It was not by any stretch of imagination. As much as I might have, every time you asked us, even going, "Oh, it was grand." It was not grand. There was a lot of work. Kerry beat Cork last week by like 20-something points, and everyone said it was easy. It was easy because they put a lot of work and preparation into it. I can't play football to save my life as much as I'd love to, and I come from the heart of Gaelic football in Kerry. I can't play Gaelic football, but I can understand the preparation and time. I've been preparing for this type of project for a very long time. I've been passionate about this type of project for a very long time, as have the guys that work in Boann, yourself, and all of the team. And the second it was muted, we all knew it was going to be hard work, but it was actually the type of work that got us excited about this industry. And I know we're not alone in Boann. I know that there's distilleries up the road in County Down and down as far as Cork, across in Galway, up in Donegal, everywhere and in between, that are passionate about the resurrection. It's one thing about this industry,
as much as there are probably people that have got in here thinking that it's an easy get rich quick industry, it is not. And you will not survive, and you will not last, and you will not realistically get into this industry unless you're blinded by passion and blinded by a kind of probably a misplaced vision of what the future of Irish whiskey could be. And I hope this is a big leap forward for Irish whiskey and its learnings. I know Fionnán O'Connor has been a big inspiration to me and a big inspiration to many of the people that are involved in the Irish whiskey industry now. So I hope this. I hope the learnings that we've got from this project are a big aid to the industry in getting back to where we should be. We should be the best producers of whiskey in the world, because we have all of the raw ingredients, literally all of the raw ingredients to do that. And so, if anybody, we're an open book in Boann, as is Fionnán's thesis. Everything that we've learned, everything I've learned in my last 10 years in the industry, I would only happily divulge, because even purely from a selfish point of view, I want. I get every bit as excited about what Cologne are doing, or Ecklenville are doing, or anybody else. I shouldn't have started naming anybody else is doing with their pots to the recipes, as we are doing ourselves. It's not a selfish thing. To like, maybe you should be selfish. Maybe I should, from a financial point of view, be more concerned that my products or products associated with me outstrip or outsell their products. But to be honest, the greatest enjoyment, one of the greatest enjoyments I get, is from tasting pots of spirit, and if I could get a couple of more lads on board with producing mash bills like this, it's only that would be the culmination of all of the work. It would have made the whole project worthwhile. So that's my 2 cents in the whole thing.
Well, I think a lot of people will echo the call, or the fanfare of other distilleries distilling spirits like this as well. For anyone that didn't manage to get their hands on a tasting pack, I think there's just a few left on the Boann Distillery web store. If you want to be able to sit down yourself and try through 10 mash bills across Irish whiskey history and perhaps into the future as well. But as I said, it's a one-time production, these packs. There's only 500 produced for the world. So when they're gone, they're most certainly not coming back. But a very big thank you to Fionnán, who I hoped to be able to rejoin us, but it doesn't look like he will be able to. Obviously, a man has put Trojan work into this project, and now I think he can sleep a little bit easier now, knowing that his sensory panels and data collection has been complete, as long as he doesn't lose those papers. And a very big thank you to you, Michael, for, as I said earlier, not only doing the distillation work with the team, but also coming on to pretty much every online forum that I could schedule for you. So I appreciate that as well. And the Cooney team, as you said, we've mentioned it 10 and 30 times, but Peter Cooney has actually been in the Belfast Whiskey Week forum as well, answering all the questions in there that we weren't able to get to. But I think I've had a lot of fun. I hope you have as well. For those watching back, there's a lot of information, so this will be available. But I know this has been the most amount of distillates I've ever had in a tasting. It is most certainly the longest live stream I've ever gone through. My job as MC was to make sure we got through all 10, and we got there. So I'm delighted. But to finally, a big thank you to everyone who's watching either now or after the fact. And of course to Paul Kane in Belfast Whiskey Week, who has made this possible as well. So I think, Michael, it's probably a good time to disconnect if you're happy with that.
Yeah, no, well, unless anybody, and I say that, my email is michael.walsh@boanndistillery.ie. If anybody has any questions about anything that I failed to mention or didn't go into more detail, or anything you would like to, that helps with broadening the knowledge of this category, I would only be delighted to help. It's more than a passion project for me. It's a vocation. It's whatever else. I'm not quite as passionate yet as Fionnán. I was thinking about going to the Skellig Islands and doing my monastic retreat or something, but I won't go quite there yet. But no, again, thank you to Belfast Whiskey Week for facilitating us tonight. Thank you to the Cooney family for facilitating the project, and thank you to everybody else for showing your interest.
it's something that I've only had the pleasure of being involved with, to be honest. So thanks again to everyone.
Yeah, perfect. All right.
Eva.